Welcome to In the Shadows. I'm Jack, and tonight I'll be guiding you through another night of scary stories to fall asleep. No ads, no interruptions, just a black screen and the soothing sound of rain in the background. If you're listening, comment below where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I'm always curious to know who's with me in the dark. If you enjoy the show, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's begin. It was around 10 p.m. when I finally checked into the hotel. The trip had been longer than expected, and all I wanted was some sleep. This town was small, quiet, and not exactly memorable. I'd passed through before, but never had to stay overnight until now. Work had dragged me out here, and this old hotel was the only option that seemed halfway decent. The building had a strange charm, like it had been elegant once but was now faded with age. As I stepped into the lobby, it felt like I'd stepped into another time. Dark wooden furniture lined the room, and a few old rugs were scattered across the floor. The lighting was dim, with just one weak lamp barely illuminating the reception desk. Behind the desk, an old man with a stern expression glanced up at me. He handed me the key to room 308 without much of a word. But there was something about the way he looked at me that made me pause. It wasn't the typical bored smile you get at hotels. He seemed like he wanted to say something, but changed his mind at the last second. I decided not to think too much about it. "Quiet night?" I asked, trying to make conversation. He nodded slowly and said, "Mostly, just you on the upper floors tonight." There was something off about his tone, but I shrugged it off and took the key. The stairs creaked as I climbed to the third floor. There was an elevator, but it looked like it hadn't been used in years. The hallway was long and dimly lit, stretching out in front of me. It felt strange, like I was the only person in the building. No other doors opened, no sounds came from behind them, just the occasional rattle from the wind outside. Finally, I reached room 308 and unlocked the door. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt different. A slight chill, even though the windows were shut. The smell hit me next. A faint musty odor mixed with something metallic. I set my bag down and looked around the room. It was old, much like the rest of the hotel. The bedspread was a weird pattern, probably from the 80s, and the furniture didn't match. But it was clean enough, so I started to settle in. Still, I couldn't shake the strange feeling the room gave me. There was a draft, but no windows were open. I checked them, ran my hand along the edges, but everything was sealed tight. Too tired to care much more, I brushed it off and climbed into bed. I turned off the lights, closed my eyes, and tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easy. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The room was darker than I remembered, and something didn't feel right. I grabbed my phone to check the time. It was just after 3 a.m. Then I heard it. A faint sound, barely there, but unmistakable. Tap, tap, tap. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the rhythm didn't match. It seemed to come from within the room, somewhere in the walls. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was probably just old pipes or something. But the sound didn't stop. It kept going, persistent, almost intentional. Frustrated, I got out of bed to look around. I checked the windows again, still shut. The sound didn't seem to be coming from there. I walked to the bathroom, flipped on the light. That's when I noticed the mirror. There was fog on it, but not from a shower. I hadn't used the bathroom since I arrived. In the middle of the fogged-up glass, there was a perfectly clear spot, like someone had wiped it. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. The draft, the tapping, the mirror. It all felt wrong, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. I turned off the light and went back to bed, hoping I could shake it off. But my sleep was restless, and morning couldn't come soon enough. By the time daylight came, the weirdness of the night had started to fade. The day was packed with meetings, keeping my mind off everything, but when I returned to the hotel that evening, the unease returned. The moment I opened the door to room 308, I noticed something. My suitcase had been moved. It wasn't far, just a few inches, but I knew I hadn't left it there. I checked the room again. Closet, bathroom, under the bed. Nothing was out of place. I called the front desk to ask if housekeeping had been in my room. The clerk paused longer than he should have before answering. "No," he said. "No one's been in your room today." That pause stuck with me. That night, it was impossible to relax. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but every little sound, every small movement, felt like it had a purpose. As I lay there trying to sleep, the tapping sound returned. Tap, tap, tap. It was louder this time, coming from above me, then behind the walls. I got up, hoping to catch whatever was making the noise, but every time I moved, the sound stopped. It felt like something, or someone, was toying with me. I turned on the TV to drown out the sound, but the TV started acting up too. It flickered a few times, and at one point the screen went completely black. When the picture came back, everything seemed fine, but I was already on edge. Then came the scratching. It wasn't loud, but it was there. It sounded like someone was dragging something across the floor outside my door. I stood up, walked over to the door, and listened. For a few seconds, nothing. Then, faint breathing, right on the other side of the door. I stayed still, unsure of what to do next. But then the breathing stopped, and the hall outside fell silent again. I checked the peephole, but saw nothing. That was it. Something was wrong with this room. I sat back down, phone in hand, trying to decide whether to call the front desk again. Instead, I opened my phone's flashlight and began looking around the room more carefully. I wanted to find out what was really going on. That's when I noticed it. The smoke detector in the corner of the ceiling. It looked odd, bigger than usual, and the small light on it was dimmer than I'd ever seen. I zoomed in with my phone, trying to get a closer look. That's when I saw it. A tiny lens, hidden inside. Someone had been watching me. My mind raced as I pieced everything together. The tapping, the suitcase, the mirror, the breathing. It wasn't in my head. Someone had been in my room, watching me the whole time. I felt a wave of anger and disgust as I realized how deep it went. I grabbed my phone and called the front desk, demanding to speak to the manager. The clerk stammered, trying to deny everything, but I told him about the camera hidden in the smoke detector, and his voice wavered. He mumbled something about not knowing anything before quickly hanging up. I wasn't sticking around to see what else they had planned. I packed my bag, threw on my shoes, and walked out of that room as fast as I could. When I passed the front desk, the clerk was gone. It was like he vanished the moment I called him out. Outside, I dialed 911 and explained what had happened. The police arrived not long after, and they started investigating the room. It didn't take them long to find what I already knew. The smoke detector was just one of many. Hidden cameras were planted in several rooms, recording everything. Whoever was behind this had been watching guests for God knows how long. The hotel was shut down a few days later. The police arrested the owner and the night clerk. Both of them had been involved in running this sick operation for years. Recording guests, selling footage online. It was worse than I'd ever imagined. I was just one of dozens of victims. The thought still makes my skin crawl. Even after the arrests, the fear never really went away. Every hotel room I checked into after that, I found myself searching for hidden cameras. I'd look at every smoke detector, every vent, every corner of the room. Even when I told myself it was over, I couldn't stop. It became an obsession. The police wrapped up the investigation, but the damage was done. I'll never feel truly alone in a hotel room again. And every time I close my eyes to sleep in one, I can't help but wonder if someone is still watching. The memory of that first night, when I thought it was just a strange draft or a tapping noise, haunts me. I was never alone in that room, and I'll never forget it. It was one of those damp, drizzly October afternoons when the rain just wouldn't let up. Dan and I had decided to go digging anyway. We always did this sort of thing, looking for relics from old settlements, artifacts that didn't belong in our quiet suburban town. There was something calming about it, sifting through layers of earth, hoping to find a piece of history. The place we chose this time was an abandoned lot just on the outskirts. It had been vacant for years, rumored to have belonged to a wealthy family that vanished mysteriously decades ago. The perfect spot for a dig, if you ask me. We had been at it for hours, soaked through despite the waterproof jackets. Dan wasn't exactly chatty, but he was good company. He'd been nursing a bad mood all week, ever since his girlfriend had broken up with him. So we worked mostly in silence, the patter of rain our only soundtrack. Just when I thought we'd be packing it in, my shovel hit something solid. It wasn't the usual clink of stone or brick. This was different, hollow, like something metallic buried beneath the dirt. I paused, expecting it to be another rusted can or an old pipe. But when I cleared away the mud, I saw it wasn't anything like that. It was a small box, intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. The metal wasn't rusted, not like you'd expect. In fact, it looked almost untouched, despite being buried so deep. Dan came over to see, wiping the rain from his face as he crouched next to me. "What do you think it is?" he asked, his voice low, almost unsure. I didn't have an answer. Something about the box felt wrong, like it didn't belong here. "Let's take it back to the house," I said, not wanting to stay in the rain any longer. We packed up our tools, the box carefully tucked into my bag, and headed back to my place. The rain fell even harder as we drove, the windshield wipers working overtime, but neither of us spoke much. Dan stared out the window, his face unreadable. As soon as we got inside, I set the box on the coffee table. We both stood there, staring at it for what felt like an eternity. Neither of us wanted to touch it again. But I couldn't help myself. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold surface. The box seemed older than anything I'd ever seen, and those symbols, they weren't just random carvings. They looked deliberate, like they held meaning, like they were part of some forgotten language. Dan backed away a little, as if the thing repelled him. "Maybe we shouldn't mess with it," he muttered. I agreed, but curiosity always gets the best of me. "I'll just do some research," I said, trying to sound casual. Dan nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. It was like we both knew something had changed the moment we dug that thing up. Something we couldn't take back. Over the next few days, I became obsessed with the box. I scoured every online forum I could find, trying to figure out what it was. None of the symbols matched anything from known civilizations. No one had seen anything like it. Dan stopped coming around as much, said he had things to deal with, but I knew the box had freaked him out. Still, I couldn't let it go. One night, after hours of fruitless research, I gave up and headed to bed. I hadn't been asleep long when I woke up to a strange noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe the old pipes in the house, but then I heard it again, this low, almost rhythmic sound. Like a whisper, but not quite. It was so faint, I couldn't make out the words. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me after spending so much time focused on that box. But the next night, it happened again. Only this time, it was louder, clearer. I got out of bed and walked down the hall, following the sound. It was coming from the living room, from the box. I stopped in the doorway, staring at it, half expecting something to happen, but nothing did. The box just sat there, silent, innocent looking, as if it wasn't the source of that strange sound at all. I stayed up late that night, waiting for it to happen again, but the sound never returned. Dan called the next day, said he was feeling off and couldn't shake the sense that we'd messed with something we shouldn't have. I tried to brush it off, said he was just overthinking things. But deep down, I was starting to wonder the same thing. More strange things happened over the next few days. Small, barely noticeable at first. A door I'd left open would be closed when I turned around, lights flickering for no reason, even though the bulbs were brand new. And that whispering, always faint, always just out of reach, but it was there. I hadn't told Dan, but I was starting to feel watched, like the box had brought something into my house that shouldn't be here. I considered getting rid of it, but how do you throw away something like that? How do you destroy something you don't even understand? The more I thought about it, the more I convinced myself that whatever was happening, it wasn't just my imagination. I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers, the strange occurrences, the growing sense that something was very wrong. Dan hadn't returned any of my calls for days. I drove over to his place, determined to talk to him in person. When I arrived, his car was there, but the house was dark. I knocked on the door. No answer. Something felt off. I let myself in. The door wasn't locked. The house was eerily quiet, no sign of Dan anywhere. I called out his name, but only silence greeted me. Walking through the empty rooms, I felt a chill creep over me. It was like Dan had just disappeared without a trace. I found his phone on the kitchen counter, dead. He never went anywhere without it. That's when I knew something was really wrong. I rushed back to my car, my mind racing. On the drive home, I kept thinking about the box. Whatever was going on, it had to be connected to that thing. I pulled into my driveway, not even sure what I was going to do. As I walked up to the house, I heard it again, that whispering sound. It was louder now, almost like chanting. I ran inside, my heart in my throat, heading straight for the living room where the box sat. But as soon as I stepped into the room, the sound stopped. I stood there, staring at it, the silence unnerving. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow, fleeting, almost human-like, darting across the far wall. I froze. I knew someone was in the house. Someone, or something. That's when I saw the figure standing just beyond the doorway. A man, but not Dan. His face was half hidden in the shadows, but I could tell he was watching me, and in his hand he held a small device. It was then that everything started to make sense. I couldn't move. The man stepped closer, holding up the device. He pressed a button, and that whispering sound filled the room again. Not supernatural, not ancient, just a recording. My mind reeled as I pieced it together. The strange sounds, the shadows, the things moving around the house, they were all part of an elaborate trick. Someone had been manipulating me the whole time, using my own fear against me. I thought back to that day in the abandoned lot, to the box we'd found. It wasn't an artifact at all. It was a decoy, something meant to scare off anyone who got too close. I dug up something I wasn't supposed to, and now they were making sure I regretted it. "Where's Dan?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to stay calm. The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back into the shadows, disappearing from view. I rushed to the window, but there was no sign of him outside. I felt sick. Dan had gotten caught up in something dangerous, and I'd walked right into the middle of it. I didn't know who these people were, but it was clear they were using that abandoned lot for something illegal. And they'd used the myth of the cursed artifact to keep people away. But we hadn't been scared off. We dug too deep. Now they were making sure we stayed silent. I went to the police the next day, told them everything about the box, the strange occurrences, Dan's disappearance. At first, they didn't seem to take me seriously, but when they checked the abandoned lot, they found evidence of a criminal operation, hidden stashes, illegal goods buried beneath the dirt. As for Dan, they never found him. The authorities launched an investigation, but it went cold within weeks. The people behind it had vanished, leaving no trace. The box was gone too, disappeared from my house without a single sign of how it had been taken. The police assured me that I was safe now, that the criminals had likely fled the area, but I never felt safe after that. I moved out of that house, sold it within months. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. I knew it was irrational. I knew there was no such thing as an ancient curse. But late at night, when the rain is falling and the wind howls outside, I sometimes hear it again, that faint whispering, just beyond the edge of my hearing. And I can't help but wonder if they're still out there waiting, or if I've brought something far worse with me. I never thought I'd come back to the old house. It had been years since I'd set foot in it, years since I'd even thought about it. But when Aunt Helen passed away, and I was left to handle her estate, I had no choice. I wasn't particularly close to her, not like some of the other relatives. Still, I was the only one who lived nearby, so it fell to me. It was a rainy evening when I first returned, of course. The kind of rain that soaks through your clothes and seems to linger in the air. I stood at the doorstep, looking at the chipped paint and crooked shutters. The house had been in our family for generations. Big, old, creaky. I'd spent countless summers here as a child, but I never felt at home. There was always something unsettling about it. I had one clear memory that haunted me more than anything. Aunt Helen's doll collection. Dozens of porcelain faces staring out from the attic's glass cabinet, cold and unmoving. I used to avoid the attic at all costs, even when the other kids dared me to go up there. Those dolls terrified me in a way I couldn't explain. Now they were mine. Aunt Helen had written in her will that the entire collection was to go to me. Why, I couldn't fathom. I pushed the thought away as I stepped inside, the door creaking open with a reluctant groan. The house smelled of dust and damp wood, like it hadn't been aired out in months. Maybe it hadn't. I dropped my bags by the door inside, looking around. Everything was just as I remembered it. Old furniture, covered in white sheets, faded wallpaper peeling at the edges, the sound of rain pattering against the windows, and the attic door slightly ajar at the end of the hallway. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. That attic had always felt wrong. Aunt Helen had spent hours up there with those dolls, dusting them, rearranging them, talking to them. She was a peculiar woman, to say the least. I always thought she was just eccentric. But now, standing in her house, the memories felt different, more sinister. I shook the thought off and walked up the stairs to the second floor. I needed to get started on packing things up. But the attic kept drawing my attention, like a pull I couldn't ignore. The old wooden stairs creaked beneath my feet as I made my way up, hesitating at the top. The attic was dim, lit only by the fading light through the rain-streaked window. And there they were. The dolls, rows of them sitting in their glass case, staring out with blank, painted eyes. I stepped closer, my fingers brushing the cold glass. Each doll had a name tag beneath it, and I remembered the stories Aunt Helen used to tell us about them. "This one belonged to your great-grandmother," she'd say, pointing to a doll in a lace dress. She died young, just after receiving it. And another, dressed in velvet, had belonged to a cousin who drowned at sea. Every doll, it seemed, was tied to a death in our family. I'd never put much stock in it, not when I was a kid. But now, looking at them, something felt off. Why would Aunt Helen keep these? What kind of person holds on to something tied to such tragedies? As I stood there, my breath fogging up the glass, I noticed something strange. One of the dolls, the one in a faded pink dress, was slightly out of place. It wasn't sitting upright like the others, but slumped forward, its face pressed against the glass. I didn't remember it being like that. Aunt Helen had been meticulous with her collection. I opened the case to fix it, my hand trembling slightly as I touched the porcelain face. It was cold, unnaturally so. I set it upright, then closed the cabinet, stepping back. For a brief moment, I thought I saw its head tilt ever so slightly, but I shook the thought away. Just my imagination. I turned and headed back downstairs, eager to get away from the attic. But as I reached the bottom, I heard a soft sound behind me like a tap. I stopped, looking over my shoulder. Nothing, just the rain. At least, that's what I told myself. I'd deal with the dolls tomorrow. Tonight, I just needed to rest. The next day started like any other, gray and overcast, with the rain still falling steadily. I busied myself with the task of going through Aunt Helen's things, sorting what to keep and what to donate. It wasn't long before I realized how much she had hoarded over the years. Boxes upon boxes filled with knickknacks, old clothes, and random memorabilia. I avoided the attic for as long as I could, but eventually I knew I had to go back up there. The dolls weren't going to pack themselves. Reluctantly, I climbed the stairs, dreading what I might find. To my surprise, everything was as I'd left it the night before. The dolls sat in their glass case, unmoving, silent, except for one. The doll in the pink dress. It had moved again, slumped forward just like before. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the house was shifting, the floor uneven, or maybe Aunt Helen had rigged something up to mess with people. She always had a strange sense of humor. But deep down, part of me wasn't convinced. I straightened the doll again, closing the case firmly this time. I made a mental note to keep an eye on it. The rest of the day passed without incident, but that night, as I was lying in bed, I heard something, a faint tapping noise coming from above. It was almost rhythmic, like someone or something was pacing back and forth. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the house settling. But the sound continued, growing louder, more insistent. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the attic. The stairs creaked under my weight as I made my way up, the tapping growing louder with each step. When I reached the top, I froze. The glass case was open. All the dolls had been moved, scattered across the floor. Every single one was facing the attic door, as if they were waiting for something. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I slowly stepped inside. My gaze fell on the pink-dressed doll, now sitting in the middle of the floor, upright and staring directly at me. I didn't move, couldn't move. Something wasn't right. I stepped forward, my foot hitting something hard. I looked down and saw a key, a small brass key that I'd never seen before. Where had it come from? I picked it up, examining it closely. There was an inscription on it, but it was too worn to make out. I didn't know what to do with it, so I slipped it into my pocket and left the attic, locking the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The tapping had stopped, but my mind wouldn't settle. What was going on? Was someone trying to mess with me? Or was it something else entirely? By the third night, I was exhausted. The rain hadn't let up, and the house felt more oppressive than ever. I kept hearing strange noises, whispers in the walls, things moving when I wasn't looking. I was beginning to think I was losing my mind. I didn't want to go back to the attic, but I had to. There was something up there that needed to be dealt with. I grabbed the key from my pocket and climbed the stairs again, heart pounding with each step. When I reached the top, I unlocked the attic door and stepped inside. Everything was in chaos. The dolls were scattered all over the floor, their lifeless eyes staring up at me. But it was the pink-dressed doll that caught my attention. It was sitting on the windowsill, its head tilted to the side, and next to it, a knife. I stared at the knife in disbelief, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Who had put it there? Was someone in the house with me? I turned around, scanning the room, but there was no one else. I grabbed the doll and the knife, storming downstairs. This had gone too far. Someone was playing a twisted game with me, and I wasn't going to let them win. I called my brother Mark, telling him everything that had happened. He was skeptical at first, but eventually agreed to come over and help me figure out what was going on. When he arrived, we searched the house from top to bottom, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no clues, nothing. But I knew something wasn't right. Someone was messing with me, and I needed to find out who. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. I spent hours going through Aunt Helen's old letters, journals, anything that might give me a clue. It was then that I found it, an old letter tucked away in the back of one of her journals. It was addressed to me. In the letter, Aunt Helen warned me about my brother Mark. She said he had always been jealous of my inheritance, and that he had a dark side I didn't know about. I didn't want to believe it, but the more I thought about it, the more things started to make sense. Mark had been the one to suggest I move into the house. He had been the one to dismiss my concerns, downplaying everything. And now he was here, in the house, trying to help me. I felt sick. I confronted him that afternoon, demanding the truth. At first, he denied everything, calling me paranoid, but I could see the look in his eyes. He knew. I pressed him harder, accusing him of setting everything up to scare me, to make me think I was going crazy. Finally, he snapped. He admitted that he had been behind it all. The dolls, the noises, the knife. He wanted the house, the inheritance, and he didn't care what he had to do to get it. I couldn't believe it. My own brother. After Mark's confession, I called the police. They arrested him, but without solid evidence, he was released on bail. I didn't feel safe in the house anymore. I packed my things and left, moving to a small apartment across town. I thought I could put it all behind me, start fresh, but something was still off. As I unpacked my boxes in the new place, I found something that shouldn't have been there. The doll in the pink dress. I froze, staring at it. How had it gotten here? Had I packed it without realizing, or had someone else put it there? I didn't know what to think anymore. Even though Mark was gone, the fear lingered. I kept the doll locked in a box, tucked away in the back of a closet, but I could never bring myself to get rid of it. Every now and then, I would hear faint tapping, like tiny feet walking across the floor. I'd tell myself it was just the building settling, just the wind. But deep down, I knew better. Some things don't just go away, they stay with you, no matter how far you run. And every night, as the rain falls and the darkness closes in, I can't help but wonder if the real nightmare has only just begun. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Hollow Creek was the kind of town where nothing ever happened. Quiet, serene, nestled deep in the woods, it felt untouched by time. The houses were old but sturdy, built by generations who believed in self-reliance and tradition. There was always a sense of security in knowing everyone by name, in exchanging pleasantries at the corner store, in recognizing every car that passed down the single main road. But beneath that calm exterior, something was lurking. Growing up, I heard the stories about people going missing near the woods. It wasn't an everyday occurrence, just the occasional person disappearing, never to be seen again. Locals would dismiss it, saying the person had run away or moved out of town without telling anyone. But there was an old legend too, one passed down through whispered conversations around campfires. They said the woods were cursed, haunted by something old, something dangerous. As a kid, I'd laughed at the stories like everyone else. But now, as an adult, the laughter had faded, replaced by unease that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. It started with a headline in the local paper. Teen vanishes after visit to Hollow Creek Woods. The boy, Jason, was only 16. His parents said he went into the woods one evening and never came back. The authorities searched for days, but there was no sign of him. It didn't take long for the rumors to start. People whispered about the woods again, about the legend of the disappearing souls. I remembered Jason. He wasn't someone I knew well, just a face I'd seen in town. But his disappearance shook the community. Even if people didn't admit it outright, they were scared. There was something unsettling about the fact that a boy could vanish so easily without a trace. The story began to fade from the public's mind, as stories like this often do in small towns, until a second person went missing. A woman this time, someone older, who was last seen walking her dog near the woods. Just like Jason, she vanished without a clue. And just like that, the old fears of Hollow Creek started to resurface. By the time the third person went missing, I couldn't ignore it anymore. People in town were on edge, though they tried to hide it behind forced smiles and polite conversation. I began to see patterns where I hadn't before. Each person who disappeared had been last seen near the outskirts of the woods, right where the dense trees began to swallow the light. And each time, there were no signs of a struggle, no witnesses, no explanations. It was as if they'd just been plucked from existence. I couldn't help but think back to the stories I'd heard as a child, about shadowy figures that roamed the forest, about how anyone who ventured too far in would never come back. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. But then something strange happened. One night, as I sat on my front porch, sipping tea and trying to unwind after a long day, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette of someone watching from the shadows of the trees. I blinked, and they were gone. Part of me wanted to believe it was nothing, just a trick of the fading light. But a part of me knew better. Over the next few weeks, I began to see more of them. Shadowy figures, standing at the edge of the woods, always disappearing the moment I tried to focus on them. I told a few friends, but they just brushed it off, saying I was probably just tired or imagining things. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One evening, I overheard a conversation between two of my neighbors at the grocery store. They were talking in hushed tones about another disappearance. A local teenager this time, who had been acting strange in the days leading up to her vanishing. She had been telling her friends that she was afraid of something in the woods. Hearing that sent a chill through me. This wasn't just a coincidence. Something was happening. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I wasn't the kind of person who could just sit back and wait for answers to fall into my lap. So one night, I asked my best friend Claire to come with me to the woods. She thought I was being ridiculous, but eventually she agreed. We armed ourselves with flashlights, and as dusk turned into night, we made our way toward the darkened trees. The woods loomed ahead of us, an almost impenetrable wall of darkness, but I pushed forward, determined to find out what was happening. As we walked deeper into the forest, the sounds of the town faded away. replaced by the unsettling quiet of the trees. The path was narrow, barely visible in the faint glow of our flashlights, and every step seemed to echo louder than it should. After what felt like hours of walking, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. I had never seen it before, even though I'd lived in Hollow Creek my whole life. There was something off about the place, something that made my skin crawl. Still, I felt drawn to it. Like this cabin held the answers I was searching for. Claire, on the other hand, wanted to turn back, but I convinced her to keep going. As we approached the cabin, I noticed movement from the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then I saw them. Figures, half hidden in the trees, watching us. I couldn't make out their faces, but they were there, standing motionless, as if waiting for something. Fear crept into my thoughts, but I didn't want to leave. Not yet. Suddenly, one of the figures stepped forward, breaking the eerie stillness. It was a man, his face obscured by a hood, and before I could react, Claire grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the path. We ran, not stopping until we reached the safety of my house. We didn't talk much after that, just sat in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin and the figures in the woods. Something about that night didn't sit right with me. I began to do some digging, researching the history of Hollow Creek and the surrounding area. That's when I stumbled across an old newspaper article. It was from decades ago, about a human trafficking ring that had been operating in the region, using the remote woods to transport and hide their victims. The article mentioned that the group had been dismantled, but some of the members had never been caught. My stomach twisted as I read on, piecing together the horrifying truth. The disappearances weren't random, and they weren't supernatural. They were the work of people, exploiting the town's fear of the forest to carry out their crimes in secret. I remembered the man in the woods, the figures watching us, and it all clicked. The urban legend about the cursed forest was nothing more than a cover for something far darker. The people who vanished hadn't run away, and they hadn't fallen prey to some ancient evil. They were being taken. Once I understood what was happening, I knew I had to act. I gathered all the information I had, notes from my research, photos I'd taken of the cabin, even the names of some of the people who had disappeared over the years. Then, anonymously, I sent everything to the FBI. Weeks passed with no word. I tried to go about my life as usual, but it was hard to shake the knowledge of what was really happening in Hollow Creek. Then one morning, I turned on the news and saw that the FBI had raided the area around the woods. Several arrests were made, but not nearly enough to take down the whole operation. And worse, the old cabin burned down in a mysterious fire, destroying much of the evidence that could have helped put more people behind bars. Somehow, despite the arrests, life in Hollow Creek went on as if nothing had happened. People went back to their daily routines, unwilling or unable to acknowledge the darkness that had been lurking in their own backyard. But I knew the truth. I knew that the people responsible for the disappearances hadn't all been caught, and I knew they were still out there, watching, waiting. One evening, as I walked to my car, I saw him, one of the figures from the woods, standing across the street, just watching me. His face was familiar, but I couldn't place him. He smiled, a knowing, unsettling grin, and then disappeared into the night. I haven't felt safe since. I never thought much about family traditions or heirlooms. That kind of thing always felt like something out of a movie or a history textbook. But when my dad passed away, and I found myself the reluctant owner of his house, I realized how deep those roots ran. The house was old, full of memories I wasn't sure I wanted to revisit, but it was mine now. It sat in the quiet neighborhood, a relic from another time, tucked behind overgrown bushes and creaky gates. I hadn't been back in years, not since college, but now I had to sort through it all. The papers, the furniture, the memories. On the second day of clearing out his study, I found a small box with my name on it. The handwriting was my father's, neat and careful, and it caught me off guard. Inside was a pocket watch, an antique, intricate, and heavier than I expected. The watch was engraved with my family's initials passed down through generations. There was a note in the box written in my father's handwriting, though it seemed more rushed than usual. "Take care of this, Daniel. It's yours now." That was it. No explanation, no sentimental words, just a strange urgency that left me feeling unsettled. I set the watch aside and tried not to think about it. But that night, after the rain started pounding against the windows, I thought I could hear ticking. It didn't make sense. I'd left the watch in the study, and yet the sound seemed to echo through the house. I tried to ignore it, assuming it was just my mind playing tricks. But the more I tried to block it out, the more I was drawn to it. The ticking became a companion in the silence of the house. The next day, I went back to the study to finish sorting through my father's things. The watch sat where I had left it, still and silent, but something about it drew me closer. I picked it up again, studying the intricate engravings, the weight of it in my hand. It wasn't just a simple watch. It felt like it had a presence, something more than just metal and gears. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just an old family heirloom, nothing more. But the thought nagged at me. My dad had been distant in his later years, and I wondered if there were things about him I didn't know. That evening, as I settled into the house again, the rain came back heavier this time. I couldn't shake the sense that the watch was at the center of it all, that it was more than just a relic. When the ticking started again, it was louder, closer. I searched the house, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I found myself standing in the study again, staring at the desk where the watch lay. It hadn't moved, but the ticking seemed to pulse in the air, demanding my attention. I called my cousin Martin, just to talk things through, to see if he remembered anything strange about the watch. He seemed casual at first, but then he made a comment that stuck with me. "That old thing? People used to say it brought bad luck, but I'm sure that's just talk." He laughed it off, but the idea settled deep in my thoughts. I tried to shake it, but as the days passed, more odd things began to happen. Objects I knew I hadn't touched seemed to shift around the house. Keys would disappear, only to turn up in strange places, like inside kitchen drawers or behind cushions. Lights flickered in ways I couldn't explain. By the end of the week, I had become obsessed with the pocket watch. The rain hadn't stopped, and neither had the strange occurrences around the house. Every night, the ticking seemed to grow louder, filling the rooms with a relentless rhythm. I began to dread the evenings. The sound would start slow, distant, almost like a whisper. Then it would grow, spreading through the walls, impossible to ignore. I even tried putting the watch away, locking it in a drawer, but the ticking never stopped. It was everywhere, in the bedroom, the hallway, even outside. I started wondering if maybe there was something wrong with me. Maybe the stress of my dad's death was getting to me. But then one night I woke up to find the watch lying next to my bed. I had left it in the study, I was sure of it, and yet there it was, ticking loudly in the darkness. That was when I realized this wasn't just about the watch. Something or someone was messing with me. I started paying closer attention to the little things. The lights flickering, the missing objects, the creaks in the floorboards. I had the feeling I wasn't alone in the house, even though I hadn't seen or heard anyone. I decided to confront Martin. If anyone knew more about the family's strange history, it was him. We had never been close, but he was the only family I had left. When he came over, it was raining, of course. He brought a bottle of whiskey like he always did, and we sat in the living room. The conversation started light, but eventually I brought up the watch again. He paused for a moment, studying me, as if deciding whether or not to say something. Then he leaned in, his voice low. "You know, there's more to that watch than just bad luck." I waited, feeling a strange tension building between us. Our grandfather, he was obsessed with it, just like our father. It was all they talked about in their final years. Martin smiled, but it wasn't a comforting one. It was knowing, almost predatory. People say the watch is cursed, that it drives men mad, but I don't believe in curses. Do you? I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, but another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Martin left after a couple of hours, but the tension remained. That night, I heard the ticking again, louder than ever before. It was as if the watch was calling to me, demanding my attention. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I spent the next few days unraveling the mystery of the watch. Something Martin had said didn't sit right with me. I started digging through my father's old papers, trying to find any clue about the watch's history. That's when I found the will. It wasn't the one I had seen before. This one was hidden, tucked away in a locked drawer in the study. The will left everything to me. The house, the savings, even the family business. Martin wasn't mentioned at all. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The strange occurrences, the constant ticking, the shifting objects. Martin had been trying to drive me out of the house, to make me believe I was losing my mind. He had been messing with the lights, moving things around, and who knows what else. All so that he could take what wasn't his. I confronted him, of course. He denied it at first, but the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. He had wanted the family fortune for himself, and he almost got away with it. In the end, I took the will to the police along with the evidence of Martin's tampering. They arrested him, but I knew it wouldn't erase the damage he had done. The house still feels haunted, though not by any curse. It's haunted by what Martin tried to do. Even now, when the rain starts falling and the nights grow long, I sometimes think I can hear the ticking again. Maybe it's just in my head. Maybe it's not. I remember when things first started feeling strange between Chris and me. It was a Tuesday night, just like any other, but he was late coming home. Chris never used to be late without telling me where he was. That night, though, he walked through the door without a word. His eyes didn't meet mine right away, and when they did, something felt off. He looked at me like I was a stranger, just for a moment. Then he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes, and he headed straight to the shower. I told myself it was nothing, just a long day at work. But later that night, while he slept, I heard him talking. It wasn't the usual mumbling or dream talk. It was something clearly, saying things like, "It's coming, it's watching." I sat up in bed, staring at him, waiting for him to wake up. He didn't. The next morning, I asked him if he remembered saying anything during the night. He laughed it off, told me he didn't remember a thing. I tried to let it go, but that weird, distant look in his eyes stuck with me. From that night on, something had shifted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't right anymore. Chris's late nights started becoming more frequent. He always had an excuse, something about work or traffic, but the explanations never seemed to add up. He'd come home covered in sweat, his hands dirty, his eyes avoiding mine. Sometimes, when I'd see him in the bathroom mirror, I'd notice bruises on his arms. I asked him about them once, and he just shrugged it off. Said he must have bumped into something at work. But it wasn't just the bruises. It was the way he moved, the way he spoke, like he wasn't really here anymore. The sleep talking got worse too. Night after night, I'd hear him mumbling strange things, like he was having conversations with someone I couldn't see. He'd say things like, "Keep them away," and "It's not safe." I tried to ignore it at first, convinced it was just stress, but I started noticing more little things that didn't make sense. One night, I found a bag of what looked like herbs in his jacket pocket. When I confronted him, he told me it was for a friend at work. Nothing to worry about. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something far worse than stress. The night I followed him was the night everything changed. He left the house late, around 10, saying he had to go pick something up from the office. But this time, I didn't stay home. I grabbed my keys and followed him, keeping my distance. He drove out of town, down this long, empty road, until he reached an old, run-down warehouse. I parked far enough away that he wouldn't see me. I watched as he met with another man, someone I'd never seen before. They stood there, talking in hushed voices, but I could tell they were arguing. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the tension between them was clear. Then, out of nowhere, Chris shoved the man against the wall. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. The man pulled out a gun, pointing it right at Chris. But Chris didn't back down. He stood there, calm as ever, like this was just another normal night for him. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This wasn't the man I married. This was someone else, someone dangerous. I stayed in my car, too scared to move, watching as Chris took the gun from the man, examined it, then handed it back. They talked for a few more minutes before Chris turned and walked back to his car. I ducked down, praying he wouldn't notice me parked just down the road. As soon as he drove off, I sat there, frozen, trying to process what I had just seen. The next morning, I couldn't pretend anymore. I waited until Chris sat down for breakfast, and then I confronted him. I asked him about the warehouse, about the man, and about the gun. At first, he denied everything, like it was all in my head. But I wasn't letting him get away with it this time. I pushed harder, demanded answers, and then he smiled. It wasn't the smile I knew. It was cold, detached, almost like he was amused. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said, his voice calm and steady. I felt a chill run through me. I asked him what he was involved in, who those people were. And that's when the truth came out. Chris had been hiding something from me for years. He wasn't just stressed from work, he was leading a double life. Drugs, violence, things I couldn't even begin to comprehend. The man I saw him with, he was part of it too. Part of this world Chris had been keeping hidden from me. I asked him why he hadn't told me, why he'd let me believe everything was normal. He just shrugged, like it didn't matter, like I didn't matter. I sat there, staring at him, wondering how I could have missed all the signs. This man, this stranger sitting across from me, wasn't my husband anymore. After that day, nothing between us was the same. Chris stopped pretending, stopped trying to hide his other life. I thought about going to the police, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Chris had connections, people who would protect him, people who wouldn't think twice about hurting me if I tried to leave. So I stayed, living in this nightmare, waiting for the day it would all come crashing down. One day, I found a note slipped under our front door. It was short, just a few words scrawled on a scrap of paper. "I'll be watching." There was no name, no signature, but I knew it was from him. Even when Chris was out of the house, even when I thought I was alone, I could feel his presence. I'd catch glimpses of him in the corner of my eye, hear his voice when the house was empty. It didn't matter that he was gone, that he wasn't here anymore. Chris was still with me, in my thoughts, in my dreams. He was always watching, always waiting, and I knew deep down that no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, I would never be free from him. It had been raining all day when Sam and I decided to hike. The idea wasn't mine. Sam, as usual, was the one with the adventurous spirit, always looking for something new, something off the beaten path. We lived in a small town, the kind of place where nothing much ever happened, so we had to make our own fun. That's how we ended up at the edge of the woods. The locals called it Blackwood, but most people around here just referred to it as the Cursed Woods. According to the rumors, it was haunted. Some said it was the spirits of people who had gone missing there, trapped forever in the trees. Others whispered about strange creatures that lived deep inside, waiting for unsuspecting hikers. I didn't believe any of it. Sam didn't either, or at least, he pretended not to. But when you live in a town where everyone talks about it, some part of you starts to wonder. The rain had started again by the time we reached the trailhead. Fat drops of water splashed against the muddy ground, turning the dirt path into a slippery mess. I pulled up my hood, glancing at Sam, who seemed unusually quiet for someone who had been so excited to explore. "You sure about this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Sam nodded, grinning, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He was trying too hard to act casual, and I could tell something was bothering him. "Come on, it's just a bunch of trees," he said, though his voice sounded strained. We set off down the trail, our footsteps squelching in the mud, the rain pouring steadily now. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. The trees were tall, their branches swaying gently in the wind, the only sound around us. But then I noticed something strange. There were these carvings on the trees, symbols I didn't recognize, etched deep into the bark. "That's weird," I muttered, running my fingers over one of the symbols. Sam came over, peering at it, but shrugged it off. "Probably kids messing around," he said, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. We continued deeper into the woods, the rain coming down harder now, soaking through our jackets. The trail started to narrow, the trees pressing in closer, the light dimming even though it was still early evening. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Just rain and trees, nothing out of the ordinary. But the deeper we went, the more unsettling things became. It wasn't just the strange carvings anymore. There were other signs. A shredded piece of fabric caught on a branch, an old, abandoned campsite with a torn-up tent and rusting pots scattered around. "Maybe we should head back," Sam said suddenly, his voice tight. I looked at him, surprised. Sam never backed down from anything, but the rain was relentless and something about the woods was starting to feel wrong. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. We turned to leave, but as we did, I saw it. A figure standing just off the trail, half hidden by the trees. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, but when I looked again, it was gone. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice low. Sam shook his head, but I could tell he had. Neither of us said anything more as we hurried back the way we'd come. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next day, the rain hadn't let up. It was one of those steady downpours that just wouldn't quit, the kind that made everything seem gray and lifeless. Sam called me early in the morning saying he wanted to go back to the woods. I wasn't sure what was driving him, but there was a new urgency in his voice. Something had gotten under his skin. "I need to figure out what we saw," he said. I tried to convince him it was probably nothing, just shadows playing tricks on us in the rain, but he wouldn't hear it. Before I knew it, we were standing at the trailhead again, rain pouring down, the trees looming ahead like dark sentinels. We followed the same path as before, this time moving faster, more deliberate. Sam was determined, his eyes scanning the trees as if looking for something specific. The strange carvings were still there, but now they felt more ominous. I hadn't noticed it the day before, but some of them looked fresh, like someone had carved them recently. Sam didn't say a word about them this time, though I saw him glance at them more than once. We pressed on, deeper than we'd gone the first time. The further we went, the less the woods felt like the familiar trails we were used to hiking. The path narrowed, the trees grew thicker, and the rain seemed to get heavier. That's when we found it. A clearing, tucked away so deep in the woods it felt like it shouldn't exist. In the center of the clearing was a cabin, old, decrepit, the wood rotting from years of neglect but still standing. "Where the hell did this come from?" Sam muttered, more to himself than to me. There were no signs of life, no trails leading to or from it. It was as if the cabin had just appeared, hidden from the world. Sam walked toward it without hesitation, but something about the place made me pause. It wasn't just the cabin itself, it was the feeling that this place was wrong, like it didn't belong. But Sam was already at the door, pushing it open with a creak that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Inside, it was dark and musty, the smell of mildew thick in the air. There were shelves lined with old books, a few broken chairs, and a table in the middle of the room. On the table were maps. Maps of the woods, with trails marked in red, and something else. Photos. Dozens of them. At first I thought they were just random hikers, but then I recognized one of the faces. It was the gas station clerk's nephew, the one who'd gone missing last year. I stared at the photo, my mind racing. "Sam," I said quietly, but he was already looking at the photos, his face pale. "We need to go," he whispered. We backed out of the cabin slowly, the rain pounding against the roof, and made our way back to the trail. But the woods were different now. It felt like the trees had shifted, the path we'd come down no longer clear. And then I saw it again. It's the figure standing just beyond the trees watching us. This time, Sam saw it too. The rain was coming down in sheets by the time we made it back to the cabin. We had tried to find our way out of the woods, but every path we took seemed to loop us back to the same spot. The cabin stood there, silent and foreboding, like it was waiting for us. "We're lost," Sam said, his voice barely audible over the rain. I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. No matter which way we went, we couldn't seem to escape. It was like the woods were keeping us here, holding us in place. Sam pushed open the cabin door again, and we stepped inside, dripping wet. There was something we hadn't noticed before. In the corner of the room, hidden behind a pile of broken furniture, was a trapdoor. I don't know why we hadn't seen it earlier, but now that we were looking at it, it was impossible to ignore. Sam crouched down, pulling at the rusted handle, and the door creaked open, revealing a set of stairs leading into darkness. Neither of us wanted to go down there, but we didn't have much of a choice. The rain wasn't letting up, and we had no idea how long we'd be stuck in the woods. Sam grabbed his flashlight and started down the stairs, with me close behind. The basement was damp, the walls slick with moisture, and the air thick with the smell of mold. But what caught my attention wasn't the basement itself. It was what was stored down there. Crates, dozens of them, all stacked neatly against the far wall. Sam opened one, and inside were weapons. Not just hunting rifles or knives, but military-grade equipment. "What the hell is this?" Sam whispered, pulling out a gun and examining it. I looked around, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. There were maps on the wall, just like the ones upstairs, but these were different. They showed more than just trails. They showed routes, markings that indicated drop points, and locations circled in red. This wasn't just some old cabin in the woods. This was something else, something much worse. Before I could say anything, we heard a sound from upstairs. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving across the floor above us. Sam and I exchanged a look, neither of us daring to move. Whoever was up there, they weren't friendly. We waited in the basement for what felt like hours, listening to the footsteps above. They weren't in a hurry. Whoever it was, they were taking their time, as if they knew we had nowhere to go. Sam tightened his grip on the gun he'd found, but I could tell he wasn't sure what to do with it. Neither of us were. Finally, the footsteps stopped. There was silence, but it wasn't comforting. It felt like we were being hunted. "We can't stay here," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the darkness. Sam nodded, and we made our way back up the stairs as quietly as we could. The cabin was empty when we emerged from the basement, but the door was wide open and the rain was still pouring in. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Sam motioned for me to follow him, and we slipped out of the cabin, sticking close to the trees. We hadn't gone far when we saw them. Two men standing just off the path, their backs to us. They were talking, but we couldn't make out the words over the sound of the rain. One of them was holding a gun. The other had a large duffel bag slung over his shoulder. They weren't hikers, that much was clear. Sam pulled me behind a tree, his face pale. "We have to get out of here," he whispered, his voice shaking. But before we could move, one of the men turned. And that's when I realized they weren't just criminals. They were part of something bigger. Something organized. The weapons, the maps, the supplies. This was a smuggling operation, hidden deep in the cursed woods where no one would think to look. The rumors, the disappearances, it was all connected. This wasn't just a place where people got lost. It was a place where people were taken, and now they knew we were here. We ran, not down the trail, not toward the cabin, but deeper into the woods, hoping to lose them in the rain and darkness. I don't know how long we ran, but it felt like hours. Every time I thought we were safe, I'd hear the snap of a branch or the crunch of footsteps behind us. They were following us. We weren't alone in the woods anymore. At some point, we stumbled upon an old logging road, overgrown and barely visible in the rain. It was our only chance. We followed it, hoping it would lead us somewhere, anywhere but here. The rain was relentless, pounding against us as we pushed through the underbrush, our clothes soaked, our limbs heavy. But eventually we saw lights. Headlights, far off in the distance, but enough to give us hope. We ran toward them, desperate for escape. When we reached the road, we flagged down the first car we saw. A trucker passing through on his way to the next town. He looked at us like we were crazy, but we didn't care. We told him what had happened, about the cabin, the men, the weapons. He drove us straight to the police station. The authorities didn't believe us at first. Who would? But when they sent a team into the woods to investigate, they found the cabin and the basement and everything we had told them. The men were gone, of course, but the evidence was enough. Enough to know that the cursed woods weren't cursed at all. They were a cover. A place for criminals to hide their operations, knowing that no one would dare go near it because of the stories. We were lucky to make it out, but I haven't been back since. And every time it rains, I think about those woods, about the men who are still out there, and I wonder if they're waiting for the next person to wander too far into the trees. Alright, so let me start by saying that I don't believe in the supernatural. I've spent over 2 decades studying the forests and wildlife of the Pacific Northwest, Olympic National Park specifically. I'm a wildlife biologist, and when I say I know the woods, I know them. Every sound, every pattern of movement, every sign left behind by the animals. The wilderness doesn't scare me. It never has. Until now. A couple of weeks ago, I was conducting a field survey in a remote section of the park, miles from the nearest trailhead. My task was routine: monitor some owl populations and assess the health of the ecosystem. This area doesn't get a lot of foot traffic, especially not in the off-season, so it's ideal for wildlife monitoring. Or at least, that's what I thought. It was early afternoon when I stumbled across a campsite. Now, this in itself was odd. The park doesn't allow camping in this area. It's protected land, but people ignore the rules all the time, so it wasn't a complete shock. What was strange, though, was the state of the camp. At first glance, everything looked normal. 2 tents, a fire pit with unburned wood stacked neatly beside it, camping chairs still positioned around the pit like they were waiting for someone to sit down. But something about it was off. I've seen hundreds of campsites over the years, and this one was missing the usual chaos. There were no signs of life, no scattered gear, no half-eaten food, no footprints leading in or out. It was like whoever had been there had just vanished. I approached slowly, careful not to disturb anything. The air felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. Now, as a biologist, I'm used to the quiet in the woods, especially when a large predator is nearby. But this silence? It wasn't the absence of noise. It was like the forest had gone dead. No wind, no birds, not even the rustle of leaves, just nothing. I examined the tents first. Both were zipped closed. I crouched down, my hand hovering over the zipper, suddenly hesitant. I don't know why, but something in my gut told me I didn't want to see what was inside. But I'm not the type to shy away from the unknown, so I unzipped the first tent. Inside were 2 sleeping bags, still rolled up like they hadn't even been used. A couple of backpacks, untouched. There were clothes neatly folded beside them. No signs of panic, no mess. It looked like they hadn't even unpacked properly before something happened. The second tent was the same. No signs of a struggle, no gear strewn about. Everything in perfect order, like whoever set up camp had left in the middle of a routine task and never came back. But the weirdest part, there were no personal items, no phones, no wallets, no IDs, nothing that could tell me who these people were. At this point, my brain's firing on all cylinders, trying to make sense of it. Maybe they went on a hike, but if that were the case, why leave their gear so untouched? Why no footprints? And why this silence? I circled the campsite, looking for tracks, any sign of where they might have gone. I'm trained to read the ground, to pick up on the smallest disturbances in the soil or vegetation. But there was nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had moved through the area at all. It was like they'd been lifted out of the camp and erased from the landscape. I'll admit, at this point, I was rattled. I've been in some strange situations out here. Bears, mountain lions, even the odd landslide. But this felt different. This felt wrong. I decided to check the fire pit next. Maybe there was something there, a clue as to what had happened. The wood was dry, untouched by flame. No one had even tried to start a fire. But as I bent down to get a closer look, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Around the fire pit, there were these tiny, precise indentations in the dirt, almost like footprints, but too small. And they weren't human. I've seen every kind of animal track you can imagine, and these didn't match anything. They were thin, almost claw-like, but elongated. Whatever made them had been standing there around the fire, but it wasn't sitting in the chairs. It was watching. I took a step back, scanning the area again, and that's when I noticed it. The shadows. I know how light plays in the forest, how the trees cast shadows in 100 different ways. But these shadows, they weren't right. They were too long, too dark, and they seemed to move against the light. I could see them creeping along the edges of the trees, shifting like they were alive, like they were watching me. Now, I'm not someone who jumps to conclusions. There's always a logical explanation, right? But I've spent enough time in the woods to know when something isn't normal. And this wasn't normal. I decided it was time to leave. I grabbed my gear and started back toward my vehicle, but the further I walked, the heavier the air got. It felt like something was following me, watching me from just beyond the tree line. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something darting between the trees, but there was nothing. Just the silence. The unnatural, suffocating silence. I finally made it back to my truck, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back as I drove away, but the entire time I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were alive in a way I couldn't explain. Like they were hiding something, or protecting it. I reported the campsite to the park authorities. They sent a search team out, but here's the thing. They didn't find anything. No tents, no gear, no tracks. Nothing. It was as if the camp had never existed. When I got back to work, I told my colleagues what I'd seen. I gave them every detail, explained the tracks, the strange shadows, the eerie silence. I thought maybe they'd take it seriously. After all, we're all scientists, trained to observe and analyze. But they laughed it off. They told me I'd been out in the woods too long, that I must have imagined it. They even started making jokes about it, asking me if I'd seen Bigfoot or if aliens were next on my list of discoveries. It's become a running joke around the office now. Every time I mention the woods, someone brings up Emily's missing campers and laughs. They think I'm crazy, and I don't know how to convince them otherwise. I'm used to being taken seriously, used to relying on facts and evidence, but this, I can't explain it. I can't give them the proof they want. But I know what I saw. I know something happened out there in the woods, something that doesn't fit into the neat little categories we like to box the world into. And I can't shake the feeling that, whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. It all started on a rainy evening. I was walking my dog, Charlie, through the neighborhood, like I always did when it happened. We were passing by Mrs. Ashcroft's house, the old lady who lived at the end of our street. She had this perfectly manicured garden, always looking like something out of a magazine. Charlie, being a dog, didn't care about any of that, and managed to slip past me. Before I could stop him, he was digging furiously in her flower bed, dirt flying everywhere. I yanked on his leash and dragged him away, but not before the damage was done. That's when she came out. Mrs. Ashcroft, with her long black raincoat and wild gray hair, stormed out onto her porch. Her eyes were sharp, cold, more like a predator's than an old woman's. She didn't yell, though. No, she just stood there, staring at me, not even looking at the mess Charlie had made. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and filled with something unsettling. "You'll regret this," she said, barely loud enough for me to hear over the rain. It wasn't what she said, but how she said it. It didn't sound like an angry neighbor scolding. It felt like a warning. I apologized, said I'd fix the garden, but she just kept staring. I turned to leave, pulling Charlie along, and I swear I could feel her eyes on my back the entire way home. That night, I couldn't get her words out of my head. The way she had said them, like she knew something I didn't, it gnawed at me. Charlie seemed fine, though, despite the limp he had developed since we got home. I figured he'd just overexerted himself digging, but the timing was strange. The rain kept falling, heavy against the windows as I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just a coincidence, just an old woman being dramatic, but part of me deep down wasn't so sure. A few days passed and I almost forgot about the whole thing. Almost, until strange things started happening around my house. It began with small stuff. I'd find things out of place, nothing major, just enough to notice. Charlie started barking at odd hours of the night, always toward the fence that separated my yard from Mrs. Ashcroft's. I figured it was animals, maybe a raccoon or stray cat wandering around in the rain. But then I found the first dead bird. It was right at the base of the fence, like it had fallen out of the sky. At first, I thought Charlie had dragged it over, but it didn't look like something a dog would mess with. It was clean. No signs of a struggle, no blood, just lifeless. I didn't think much of it, tossed it out, and moved on with my day. But then I found another one. Same spot, right by the fence. Now I was starting to get freaked out. I started looking over toward Mrs. Ashcroft's house every time I left the house, half expecting to see her standing there, watching. But she was never outside. I couldn't help but wonder if she had something to do with it. That night, the lights in my house flickered. It wasn't just a brief flicker either. They'd dim for minutes at a time, then brighten, like someone was playing with the circuit breaker. The rain outside had only gotten worse, beating against the house like it was trying to get in. I tried not to let it get to me, but the unease was there, creeping into my thoughts. Charlie wouldn't settle down, pacing around the house like he knew something was wrong. The second dead bird was still fresh in my mind. I couldn't sleep that night, no matter how hard I tried. Something kept pulling me back to the window, staring out into the rain-soaked night, waiting for something. It all came to a head on the night I found the symbol on my front door. I had just gotten home from work, soaked from the rain, when I saw it, a strange, twisted mark, drawn in some kind of dark paint or ink. It was crude but unmistakable, like something you'd see in one of those old horror movies. My first thought was that it was just some kids pulling a prank, but deep down, I knew it was her. Mrs. Ashcroft. The thought hit me hard, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Everything that had happened, the birds, the flickering lights, Charlie's restless behavior, it all pointed back to her. I grabbed a flashlight and stormed over to her house, my shoes splashing through puddles as I crossed the street. I banged on her door, louder than I probably should have, but I didn't care. I wanted answers. There was no answer, no sound from inside, just the steady drum of rain on the roof. I shouted her name, demanding she come out, but nothing. That's when I heard it, a laugh, low and raspy, coming from the other side of the door. I froze. It was her, no doubt about it. But she wasn't coming out. She was toying with me, playing some sick game, and I wasn't going to let her win. I ran back to my house, adrenaline coursing through me, but when I got there, the symbol on the door was gone. Gone, like it had never been there. I stood there, soaked to the bone, staring at the blank wood, trying to make sense of it. Had I imagined it? No, I couldn't have. It was there. I knew it was. But now, all I could do was wait, and waiting only made things worse. The next day, I decided I needed to know more. I wasn't going to let Mrs. Ashcroft get inside my head any longer. I waited until I saw her leave the house, then I went over. I wasn't planning to break in, just investigate. Her backyard was a mess, completely overgrown, which was strange considering how perfect her front garden always looked. It was like she only cared about appearances where people could see. The shed in the back caught my eye. It looked old and worn down, barely holding together in the storm. I forced the door open, half expecting it to collapse, and what I found inside made my stomach turn. There were photographs, dozens of them, all of me. Pictures of me walking Charlie, mowing my lawn, even sitting in my living room through the window. I felt sick, realizing she had been watching me for weeks, maybe months. But that wasn't the worst part. There were objects too, strange little trinkets, things I recognized from around my house, like a pair of gloves I thought I'd lost. And then I found something that nearly made me leave then and there. It was a journal, filled with notes all about me, how I reacted to certain things, how I looked when I found the dead birds, how she had planned everything down to the last detail. I wasn't cursed. I was being hunted. I called the police the moment I got home. They came and investigated, but there wasn't much they could do. Sure, they found the photos, the journal, but none of it was enough to press serious charges. Harassment, maybe. Trespassing at best. Mrs. Ashcroft didn't even deny it when they questioned her. She smiled, said she was just keeping an eye on the neighborhood. I knew better, though. She wasn't just watching, she was tormenting me. They arrested her, but she was out by the next morning. Nothing stuck. I couldn't sleep that night, and the next few nights after that weren't any better. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. That smile, that laugh. I tried to go back to normal, but how could I, knowing she was still out there, just across the street? A week later, I found another dead bird, right by the fence. The same fence Charlie used to bark at every night. I couldn't take it anymore. I boarded up my windows, put up cameras, but no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching. I never saw her again after that, not directly, but every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, something watching from her house. Maybe it was her, maybe it wasn't. But either way, I knew I'd never really be free. Because even after all that, she had won. She had gotten into my head, and I couldn't get her out. When I first moved into the house, it didn't feel much different from any other house I'd lived in before. It was an old place, built in the 1930s, but it had been renovated enough to keep it from feeling too outdated. I liked the quiet. The neighborhood was calm, the type of place where people mind their business and keep to themselves. It was exactly what I needed after moving out of the city. The house itself wasn't anything special. Just a two-story suburban place with creaky floors and a few quirks. I spent most of my days working from home, sitting at my desk by the window in the downstairs office. It was during one of those quiet afternoons when I first noticed her. The light was fading. It must have been around dusk. I glanced up from my computer and saw a figure in the window across the hall from my office. It was a girl, standing still, her dark hair framing her pale face. She was just looking out of the window, staring down at the street. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe a trick of the light playing off the glass. I looked again, but she was still there. It didn't make sense. I hadn't heard anyone come into the house. I stood up slowly and stepped into the hallway, keeping my eyes on the upstairs window as I moved. By the time I reached the foot of the stairs, she was gone. I walked upstairs, more out of curiosity than concern, and checked the room where I had seen her. Nothing. The window was closed, and the room was empty, just as I had left it earlier. I shook my head, half laughing at myself for being so jumpy in my own house. It was an old place. Things creaked. Shadows moved. But I couldn't stop thinking about the girl. I went back downstairs, trying to get back to work. But I couldn't shake the strange feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. The days passed uneventfully after that first sighting. For a while, I managed to convince myself it had just been my imagination. Old houses have a way of playing tricks on you when you're not used to their noises. But then things started happening again. It wasn't just seeing the girl anymore. It was little things, things that didn't add up. I would leave a door closed, only to find it open when I returned. Sometimes I would hear faint sounds, like footsteps overhead when I knew no one else was there. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself it was just the house settling, or maybe the wind. But the more it happened, the harder it became to brush off. One night, as I sat in the living room watching TV, I heard a faint thud from upstairs. I paused, listening, but the sound didn't come again. I stood up, making my way toward the stairs, when I caught sight of her again. The girl was standing in the same upstairs window, looking out at the street. This time, there was no mistaking it. She was there. I felt frozen for a moment, just staring up at her as she stood perfectly still, watching something outside. I called out, but she didn't move. I hurried up the stairs, my footsteps loud on the old wooden steps. By the time I reached the window, she was gone again. The room was just as empty as before, but this time the window was open. A chill breeze blew in, sending the curtains fluttering. I slammed the window shut, confused, frustrated, and more than a little unnerved. Someone had to be getting into the house, but I couldn't figure out how. I checked all the locks and windows that night, making sure everything was secure before going to bed. But sleep didn't come easy. The memory of the girl's face lingering in my mind long after I closed my eyes. Weeks went by, and the strange events only got worse. The girl appeared more often, always at dusk, always in the same window. Things in the house started to go missing. Small things at first, like a pair of socks or a kitchen utensil. But then I started finding things out of place. A chair moved slightly, a cup left in a different room. I was losing track of things, but I knew it wasn't just forgetfulness. It was as if someone was living in my house, moving around when I wasn't looking. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps above me in the attic. They were slow, deliberate, like someone pacing. I had never even been up to the attic. The idea of anyone being up there unsettled me. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the ladder that led to the attic door in the hallway. The sound stopped as I pulled the ladder down and climbed into the dark space above. The air up there was heavy with dust, and the beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness. At first, everything seemed normal, just boxes and old furniture covered in sheets. But then, I saw something in the far corner. A small pile of blankets, some old food wrappers, and a few empty cans. Someone had been living up here. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. Then I saw her. She was crouched in the corner, hiding behind a stack of boxes, her wide eyes staring back at me in the beam of the flashlight. It wasn't a ghost. It was a real, living girl. I stood there in shock, staring at the girl huddled in the corner of my attic. Her hair was tangled, her clothes dirty and torn, and she looked terrified. I didn't know what to do. I lowered the flashlight, trying not to scare her any more than she already was. She looked like she was about 12, maybe 13, but there was something in her eyes that seemed far older. I spoke softly, asking who she was, how she had gotten into my house. At first, she didn't say anything, just stared at me with those big, frightened eyes. Then, after what felt like forever, she whispered that she had been hiding in the attic for months. She told me about her stepfather, how he had hurt her, how she had run away and found her way into the house when it had been empty. She had been living in the attic ever since, sneaking out when I wasn't around to find food, moving through the house at night to avoid being seen. It was all too much to take in. The girl I had been seeing in the window wasn't some ghost. She was a homeless child, trapped in my house with nowhere to go. I felt a mix of emotions, anger at her situation, fear for her safety, and guilt that I hadn't realized what was happening sooner. I told her I was going to help her, that she didn't have to hide anymore. But she was scared. She didn't want me to call the police. She begged me not to. I didn't know what else to do. I promised her I wouldn't let anything happen to her, but I couldn't just leave her like this. I made the call the next morning. The authorities arrived and they took her away. I'll never forget the way she looked at me when they led her out of the house. She was scared, but there was also a hint of relief in her eyes. The police confirmed her story later. Her stepfather had been abusive, and she had been missing for months. They found him not long after, and he was arrested. But the girl's situation still haunts me. For weeks after she left, I couldn't stop thinking about her, about how close I had come to ignoring the signs. The house didn't feel the same after that. Every little sound reminded me of her. Every creak in the floorboards felt like a ghost of the life she had lived in my attic. I would catch myself glancing at the upstairs window, half expecting to see her standing there, staring down at the street. Even now, I still think about her sometimes. The authorities said she was placed in a foster home, that she was safe now. But part of me can't help but wonder if she'll ever truly be okay after everything she went through. The house may be empty now, but it doesn't feel like it. Not really. And I'm left with a lingering sense of guilt, wondering how I could have missed the signs for so long. I wasn't really surprised when things started going wrong, not at first. I had just broken up with Greg, and everyone warned me about how bitter he could be. We'd been together for a while, longer than I should have allowed, honestly. Greg was charming at first, as they always are, but there was something darker about him. He had this obsession with magic, not the sleight of hand kind, but the real, occult stuff. At first I didn't take it seriously. I mean, who would? A grown man talking about curses, rituals, and symbols like he was in some sort of movie. But after the breakup, things changed. It wasn't an easy breakup either. He looked at me with these eyes that felt wrong. Cold and distant, like I wasn't even a person anymore. He said something I haven't been able to shake since that day. "You'll regret this. You'll see, I don't need to touch you to ruin everything." It was cryptic, sure, but I didn't think much of it until strange things started happening. It started small. I'd come home, and my front door would be slightly ajar. I thought I must have left it like that, though I couldn't remember doing it. Then my keys disappeared. Not lost, disappeared. I always kept them in the bowl by the door, a habit I never broke. But one evening, they were gone. I searched everywhere, even in places that didn't make sense, like the fridge and bathroom drawers. I gave up eventually, but the next morning, there they were, sitting on the coffee table. I live alone. There was no one else who could have moved them. Then came the whispers. Late at night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I'd hear them. Low, murmuring voices like they were coming from another room, but there was no one there. I checked, of course. Every room, every closet, every dark corner of my small apartment, but I found nothing. I started feeling like I was losing my mind, but then I remembered Greg and his threats. Could he really have done something to me? Was this his dark magic at work? It sounded ridiculous, even in my own head, but with each passing day, the idea seemed less absurd. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was all just in my head, but the signs kept coming. I'd find things in places I hadn't put them. My phone in the bathroom sink, a glass of water tipped over on the nightstand. I started feeling like I was being watched, even when I was alone in my apartment. But the scariest thing was the doll. It showed up one night, sitting on my front porch, looking up at me like it had been waiting. It was old, with cracked porcelain skin and eyes that seemed too real, too lifelike. I don't own any dolls. I brought it inside, stupidly, thinking maybe it was some neighborhood prank. But when I sat it down on the kitchen counter, it felt like the air around me shifted, like something had come into the house with it. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept hearing noises, faint taps, like someone was walking around just out of sight. The next morning, I found the doll on my bed, though I had left it in the kitchen. I knew then that this wasn't just some prank. Greg had to be behind this. I started searching online for answers, looking up curses, hexes, and spells. The more I read, the more convinced I became that Greg had somehow cursed me. I even called Julie, my best friend, to tell her what was happening. She laughed it off, told me I was being dramatic, that it was just stress and paranoia from the breakup. But I could hear it in her voice. She didn't really believe me. And I couldn't blame her. What kind of person actually believes in curses and magic? But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Things only got worse after that. Every night I'd hear more and more whispers. Sometimes I thought I saw shadows moving in the corners of my eyes, only to turn and find nothing. The doll appeared in different places every morning. I started locking it in the closet, but somehow it would always end up back in my bedroom. Then the text started. It was an unknown number, sending me messages that made my blood freeze. "I'm watching you. You can't escape me." I tried blocking the number, but the messages kept coming. Every time, a different number, but the same message. "I know where you are." At first, I thought Greg was just trying to scare me. He knew me too well, knew that I'd start believing it was something supernatural. But then things got more physical. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps just outside my bedroom door. I was sure of it this time. There was someone in my apartment. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed and crept out into the hallway. But no one was there. I checked every room, every window, every door. They were all locked, just like I had left them. The next morning, though, I found my back door wide open. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a curse. Someone had been in my house. I couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't just some twisted prank or magic curse. Greg was stalking me. He'd somehow found a way to get into my apartment without leaving any signs of forced entry. Every strange thing that had happened, the missing keys, the doll, the noises at night, it all started to make sense. He was messing with my head, trying to make me believe I was cursed, that I was losing my grip on reality. I felt so stupid for falling for it. But how was I supposed to know? Who would suspect something so cruel, so personal? I didn't want to believe it, but the truth was right in front of me. Greg was doing everything he could to make me feel helpless, to make me question my sanity. I went to the police. They took a report, but there wasn't much they could do without solid evidence. They told me to change my locks, install cameras, and stay alert. It wasn't enough. I started carrying pepper spray, checking over my shoulder every time I left the house. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined Greg watching me, waiting for his next move. I did everything I could to protect myself. I installed new locks, cameras, and alarms, but Greg was smarter than I gave him credit for. One night, I caught him on the camera, standing outside my window, staring in. He didn't do anything, just stood there, watching. I called the police again, and this time, they took it more seriously. They arrested him for stalking, but I knew it wasn't over. Greg wasn't just a man who had been hurt by a breakup. He was twisted, obsessed. Even now, after all this time, I still feel like he's out there, waiting, plotting. The cameras are still up, the locks are still changed, but the fear remains. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. It all started on a rainy afternoon when I wandered into an old, dusty antique shop. I was just killing time, waiting for the storm to pass. The kind of place you'd walk by 1,000 times and never notice, but something about that day drew me in. Rows of forgotten relics, faded photographs, and chipped furniture cluttered the tiny space, giving off a sense of things better left untouched. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but as I scanned the room, something caught my eye. It was a mask, hanging on the back wall, just barely visible through the shelves. Carved from dark, weathered wood, its eyes hollow and lifeless, staring out into the dim light of the shop. The face, twisted in a grotesque grin, had an air of menace to it, like it had seen things. The shopkeeper must have noticed me staring, because he shuffled over, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. "Ah, you found the demon mask," he said with a chuckle, though there was nothing amusing about the way he said it. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Some say it's cursed, houses a demon. Bad things tend to happen to those who own it." I should have walked away right then. I wasn't the kind of guy who believed in that stuff. But there was something about the mask. Something that pulled me in, despite the pit forming in my gut. I asked the shopkeeper how much, and he hesitated, almost like he didn't want to sell it. But then he shrugged, gave me a price, and just like that, the mask was mine. I brought it home, thinking it would make an interesting conversation piece. It wasn't until later that I started to regret it. At first, it was little things I could easily explain away. I'd set the mask on the mantle in my living room, where it stared at me every time I sat down to relax. I swear it was always facing me, no matter where I stood in the room. But that was ridiculous, right? Just my imagination playing tricks on me. Then I'd come home to find things slightly out of place. A book knocked over, a picture frame tilted, little things like that. I told myself I was being careless, that I'd probably bumped into them without noticing. But it kept happening. Almost every day I'd come home to something different. And the mask? It felt like it was watching me. I mentioned it to my business partner, Tom, one day over lunch. He laughed it off, told me I was just stressed. We were in the middle of a big deal, and he said it was probably taking its toll on me. Maybe he was right. But the more I tried to brush it off, the more unsettled I felt. Lily, my girlfriend, came over one night and immediately noticed the mask. She wrinkled her nose and asked why I'd brought something so creepy into the house. I shrugged, not really sure how to explain the strange pull it had on me. She joked about it being haunted, even suggested I get rid of it, but I couldn't. It was just a mask, after all, just a stupid piece of wood. But the longer it sat there, the more I started to question everything. It was a cold, rainy night when things really spiraled. I'd been sleeping fitfully, tossing and turning, when I woke to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, a sort of whispering that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I sat up in bed, straining to hear, convinced I must be dreaming. But the sound didn't stop. It seemed to drift through the walls, soft but unnerving. I got up, heart pounding in my chest, and made my way to the living room. The mask was there, in its usual spot, but something about it felt wrong, like it was more alive than it had ever been. I don't know why, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. As I stood there, I swear I saw it move, just a fraction, but enough to send a jolt of fear through me. I stumbled back, rubbing my eyes, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, but it was still there, twisted grin and all, staring at me like it knew something I didn't. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the mask and threw it into the closet, slamming the door shut. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I called Tom in the middle of the night, desperate for someone to tell me I wasn't losing it. He picked up, groggy and annoyed, but when I told him what had happened, he seemed concerned. He promised to come by the next day, said we'd figure it out. But something about his tone didn't sit right with me. Tom showed up the next morning, as promised, acting like the good friend he always was. But the more we talked, the more uneasy I felt. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about him seemed off. He kept asking me questions, probing, like he was trying to get me to admit something. Like he wanted me to say I was losing my mind. That's when Lily showed up, looking frazzled. She had something in her hand, a folder. She handed it to me, her voice tight with worry. Inside were emails, text messages, all from Tom. They were conversations I hadn't seen, ones where he painted me as unstable, erratic, paranoid. I flipped through them, shock settling in as I realized what was happening. Tom had been planting seeds of doubt about me for weeks, maybe longer. He'd been sabotaging me, both at work and in my personal life. The strange events, the mask, the whispers, it all made sense now. He'd been orchestrating everything, making me think I was losing it. Also, he could push me out of the business and take over. I confronted him right there in my living room, my voice shaking with anger. He denied it, of course, tried to laugh it off like it was some big misunderstanding. But the evidence was right in front of me. He'd been playing me from the start. I reported Tom to the authorities. It didn't take long for an investigation to begin. Turns out he'd been doing more than just gaslighting me. He'd been embezzling money from the company, too. The whole mask thing was just part of his twisted game to make me look crazy. After the police got involved, Tom disappeared. No one's seen him since, but they're still looking. As for the mask, I couldn't stand to have it in the apartment any longer. I threw it in the trash, convinced it was just a symbol of everything Tom had done to me. But the funny thing is, even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Every time I walk past the closet where the mask used to be, I pause. Just for a second, but long enough to feel that familiar unease creep back in. I know it's just my mind playing tricks on me. At least that's what I tell myself. But there are nights when the rain is falling hard and the wind whistles through the cracks in the windows that I still hear the whispering. It was one of those nights where nothing exciting ever happened, and boredom started creeping in. Lucy's house always seemed too big, especially when her parents were out of town. The rooms stretched on endlessly, and that night, with the rain tapping against the windows, it felt even emptier. We were all there, Me, Lucy, Kyle, and Matt, just looking for something to kill time. We'd already done the usual, watched a few movies, messed around on our phones, but that restless energy hung in the air. Then Lucy brought it up, the mirror game. She'd read about it online somewhere, something about an old ritual where you light a candle, say a name in front of a mirror, and supposedly summon a spirit. Kyle immediately jumped on the idea, eager to make fun of anyone who got scared. Matt, quieter than the rest of us, didn't seem so sure, but he wasn't the type to say no. And me? I wasn't into the whole supernatural thing, but it was either that or sit in silence all night. So we went for it. We set up in Lucy's bathroom, the smallest room in the house, with an old, oval-shaped mirror above the sink. The candle flickered as we lit it, casting odd shapes against the walls, like the shadows were moving on their own. Lucy stood in front of the mirror, her face lit by the weak glow of the flame. For a second, I thought she looked different, darker somehow. She started the chant, her voice low, repeating the strange name she'd found on some website. 3 times, just like the ritual demanded. Nothing happened at first, just silence and our own nervous breath hanging in the air. Kyle was already gearing up to make a joke when the mirror fogged up. We hadn't touched it, hadn't breathed near it. It just fogged up on its own, slowly, like someone had pressed their face against the glass. Lucy wiped at it, leaving smudges, but the fog kept coming back. Kyle snorted, saying it was probably just the humidity, but even he sounded less sure of himself. Matt backed away, his eyes darting around the room, but Lucy stayed there, staring at the mirror. Her reflection moved with her, but not quite right, like it was a second too slow. None of us said a word, but we all felt it. Something wasn't right. The game went on, but that playful mood from earlier had vanished. Kyle stepped up next, smirking like he wasn't the least bit bothered. He mimicked Lucy, exaggerating the chant, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But even he couldn't ignore how strange the room felt. The candle flickered again, the flame nearly going out as he finished the last chant. And then we saw it. Something shifted in the mirror. A shadow, maybe, something moving behind Kyle's reflection. We all saw it. Kyle turned around, expecting to see someone there, but the space behind him was empty. He tried to laugh it off, but it wasn't convincing. None of us were laughing now. It was Matt's turn next, and he hesitated at the edge of the room. He didn't want to do it, I could tell. But Lucy pushed him, teasing him about being scared. So he stepped up to the mirror, standing in the same spot where Lucy and Kyle had been. The candlelight flickered against his face, casting long shadows across his features. His voice was barely above a whisper as he said the words, his eyes fixed on the glass. Nothing happened for a moment, but then his reflection seemed off. It didn't look like him, not exactly. The face in the mirror had a strange expression, almost like it was smiling, even though Matt wasn't. We all stared at the mirror, none of us sure what to say. Matt stepped back quickly, shaking his head like he just snapped out of a bad dream. "I saw something," he muttered. "Behind me." Kyle tried to joke again, but there was an edge to his voice that hadn't been there before. "Man, you're just freaked out by the stories," he said. But we all knew something had shifted. None of us could shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a silly game. Lucy wasn't finished, though. She wanted to try again, to push it just a little further. We should have stopped her, but no one said anything. We were all too wrapped up in the weirdness of the moment. She stepped up to the mirror for a second time, holding the candle in front of her. The rain outside was coming down harder now, tapping faster against the windows. The room felt different, smaller somehow, like the walls were closing in. Lucy's reflection shimmered in the glass, distorted by the weak flame. She began to chant again, slower this time, like she was trying to drag out the words. As she spoke, the mirror seemed to warp, the edges of her reflection bending in ways that didn't make sense. And then, she was gone. One moment she was standing in front of us, the next, the space was empty. We all stared at the mirror, frozen, unsure of what had just happened. "Lucy?" Kyle's voice cracked as he called her name, but there was no answer. She wasn't there. We ran through the house, calling for her, searching every room. Nothing. It was like she had vanished into thin air. Matt stood in the hallway, his back pressed against the wall, his face pale. "She's gone," he whispered, barely loud enough to hear. Kyle threw open the front door, stepping out into the rain, shouting for Lucy into the night. But the street was empty. No sign of her anywhere. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at the spot where she had been, trying to make sense of it. But all I saw was my own reflection, looking back at me. Lucy was gone, and there was no explanation for it. We searched everywhere, every corner of the house, but Lucy was nowhere to be found. The front door had been locked. The windows were all closed. There was no way she could have left without us noticing. But still, she was gone. Matt sat down in the living room, his hands shaking, his eyes wide. "I saw someone," he said, his voice hollow, "in the mirror, behind her." At first, I thought he was just panicking, but there was something in the way he said it. It didn't sound like he was talking about a ghost. It sounded like he had seen someone real. Kyle stopped pacing, his face tight with worry. "You think someone's here? In the house?" he asked, his voice low. Matt nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I've been seeing things for weeks," he admitted. "Strange things, but I didn't think it was anything." A sick feeling settled over us as we realized this wasn't just a game anymore. Someone had been watching us, planning this, waiting for the right moment to take Lucy. We didn't know what to do, so we kept searching. And that's when we found the note. Taped to the back of a mirror in Lucy's room, scrawled in red lipstick. "One of you was always meant to disappear." The police came later, but by then, it was too late. Lucy was gone, and all we had was that note. They questioned us for hours, trying to piece together what had happened, but even we didn't know. We told them everything. The mirror game, the fog, the strange reflections, but none of it made sense. It wasn't until they looked at Lucy's phone that they found the truth. She'd been talking to someone online. Someone who had known about the ritual. Someone who had been following her for weeks, waiting for the right time to act. The whole thing, the mirror, the game, the vanishing, had been a setup. They had used the ritual to cover their tracks, to make it seem like something supernatural had taken her. But it wasn't a ghost or a spirit. It was a person. A real, living person who had been watching us all along. Lucy was found days later, alive, but traumatized. The person who took her had planned everything, down to the last detail. The authorities handled it from there, arresting the kidnapper, but the damage was done. Our group never recovered from that night. Matt moved away, unable to shake the guilt of what he'd seen. Kyle stopped joking around, his confidence shattered by what had happened. And me? I couldn't look at mirrors the same way again. Every time I saw my reflection, I half expected to see someone else standing behind me, watching, waiting. Then one day, I got a message from an unknown account. It was a picture of a mirror, just like the one from that night, and beneath it, a single caption, "See you soon." We moved into the house on a cloudy autumn day. The kind of day where the sky is a thick gray blanket and everything seems dim, even though it's midday. It felt like a fresh start. Our old place was too small, cramped with memories we were ready to leave behind. This new house had potential. Sure, it needed some work, but nothing too serious. The previous owner had apparently left the place in a hurry, which meant we got a good deal on it. We figured they just moved out quickly for a job, or maybe something personal. People do that all the time, right? It wasn't the fanciest place in the neighborhood, but it had a certain charm. The front porch was a little weathered, and the paint was peeling here and there, but it felt like a home. We laughed as we unpacked, throwing around jokes about turning it into something straight out of a renovation show. The kids were excited to explore their new rooms. The rain started in the late afternoon, a steady drizzle that seemed to seep into everything. By evening, the sound of rain tapping against the windows had become background noise. We sat in the living room, surrounded by boxes we hadn't touched yet. The house was quiet except for the rain, a kind of peaceful stillness settling over us. I remember glancing at the staircase that led to the second floor. There was something about it, not creepy exactly, just off. But it's an old house. Old houses have their quirks. We settled in for the night, exhausted but happy. It felt good to finally relax. The rain picked up, heavier now, the kind that made it hard to sleep. Still, I closed my eyes, confident that tomorrow would bring more progress and more unpacking. That's when I heard it. A soft thump from upstairs. It could have been anything. Probably something settling in one of the rooms, I told myself. But I couldn't shake the sense that it sounded like a footstep. Slow, deliberate. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. Nothing followed. Just the rain. Eventually I drifted off, convincing myself it was nothing. The next morning was uneventful. We spent the day unpacking, arranging furniture, and arguing over where to put things. The house was starting to feel more like ours, little by little. But there was this weird feeling I couldn't put my finger on. Every now and then, I'd walk past a room or a hallway and swear something had moved, like I'd catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. But when I looked again, everything was still. I told myself it was just me being tired. It was probably the stress of the move. By evening, the rain had returned, heavier this time, hammering against the roof and windows. We gathered in the living room again, trying to make sense of where all our things should go. But the weird feeling from earlier was still with me. The house felt different, somehow. I noticed it when the kids went upstairs to their rooms. I swear I could hear whispers coming from the second floor. It was so faint, I almost didn't catch it at first. I strained to listen, but the whispers faded as quickly as they'd appeared. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was the wind, or the rain. But whispers? That was new. I decided to check on the kids. They were fine, already half asleep in their beds, completely unaware of anything strange. I returned downstairs, telling myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. But the house seemed quieter now. Too quiet. A few days passed and the strange occurrences continued. Things would move around. Furniture we hadn't touched would be in different places. Doors we knew we'd closed would be open the next morning. I couldn't explain it. At first, I thought maybe the kids were playing pranks, but they denied it every time I asked. One night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I stayed up late finishing some work in the dining room. The rain had returned, relentless and pounding against the windows, but I was used to it by now. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from upstairs. I shot up from my chair, heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't just a noise this time. It sounded like something heavy had been knocked over. I grabbed my phone, using its light to guide me as I crept up the stairs. When I reached the second floor, everything was still, too still. I checked the kids' rooms first. They were sound asleep, undisturbed. But as I turned towards the hallway, I felt something. A presence. It was like someone was standing there, just out of sight. The attic door was slightly ajar. I hadn't even realized we had an attic. Slowly, I approached it, feeling my skin crawl with every step. I pushed the door open and pointed my phone's light into the dark, dusty space. That's when I saw it. An old mattress, worn and stained, tucked away in the far corner. Empty food wrappers scattered across the floor. And then, I heard breathing. Heavy, labored breathing coming from behind the boxes stacked against the wall. I stumbled back, almost tripping as I turned to run. Whatever was in that attic. I didn't want to find out. I rushed downstairs, my mind racing with 1,000 possibilities. Was someone living in our house? It didn't make sense, but the more I thought about it, the more it clicked. The strange noises, the moved furniture, the open doors, all of it made sense now. I grabbed my phone and called the police, trying to keep my voice steady. They arrived within minutes, their sirens cutting through the stormy night. I explained everything as best I could. They didn't hesitate. They went straight up to the attic, weapons drawn. What they found confirmed my worst fear. A man, disheveled and wild-eyed, had been living up there for God knows how long. He barely spoke as they cuffed him, but when he did, it was nothing but incoherent mumbling. The police told us he was the previous owner. He'd never left. The man was taken away, but the damage was done. Our home didn't feel like a home anymore. Every creak, every whisper of wind made me wonder if someone else was lurking in the shadows. It's been months since that night, but the feeling hasn't gone away. I still think about that attic, about the man who lived there. What was he doing all those nights we thought we were alone? How close had he been? There are moments when I wake up in the middle of the night convinced I hear something. Footsteps, or maybe just the rain. But I can't shake the sense that someone's still there, somewhere, watching, waiting. It was one of those long, dreary autumn evenings when I first brought Shadow home. The rain tapped rhythmically against the windows, a soft drizzle coating the world in a damp grayness that matched my mood. I had just moved into this quiet neighborhood a few months ago after my breakup, trying to settle into a new routine and forget the past. The house was modest, a little one-story thing, but it was enough for me. The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked, went to work, came home, and tried to ignore the emptiness. Then, one Saturday afternoon, I found myself at a local animal shelter, thinking that maybe a pet would be good company. I wasn't looking for anything specific, but there he was, a sleek black cat, sitting calmly in the back corner of his cage. He seemed almost too calm, just staring at me with those wide yellow eyes. I asked the shelter worker about him, and she hesitated for a moment before telling me his name was Shadow. Apparently, Shadow had been there for a while, longer than most of the other cats. People didn't want a black cat. Something about bad luck, especially in a place like this, where superstition ran deep. I didn't believe in that kind of thing, so I shrugged it off and filled out the adoption papers. When I brought him home, he wandered around the house like he'd lived there his whole life. He didn't hide, didn't act nervous, just calmly inspected every corner, then sat by the window as the rain drizzled outside. It seemed peaceful at first, like having another presence in the house took away some of the quiet. But that first night, I woke up to the sound of something shattering in the kitchen. I groaned, figuring Shadow had knocked something off the counter. When I got to the kitchen, the floor was covered in shards of glass, a plate lying broken in pieces. Shadow sat on the counter, staring at me, just staring. His eyes seemed almost too focused, locked on mine like he was trying to tell me something. I brushed it off as coincidence and cleaned up the mess. But part of me couldn't shake that unsettling feeling. As the days went by, more things began to happen. A picture frame fell off the wall while I was in the living room, and the TV switched channels by itself more than once. And every time, there was Shadow sitting nearby watching me. I couldn't explain it, but it was almost like he was expecting something to happen. Then, my neighbor, Mr. Miller, started making his presence known. I hadn't spoken to him much before, just a nod or two when we crossed paths. But one day, as I was leaving for work, he stopped me at the edge of the driveway. "Black cat, huh?" he said, his voice gravelly and low. I nodded, not thinking much of it. "Yeah, his name's Shadow." Miller's eyes narrowed as he leaned in closer. "You know about the curse, right?" he asked. I laughed awkwardly, not sure if he was joking or not. "Curse?" I repeated, trying to keep it light. He didn't smile. "That cat, bad things happen to people who take him in. I've seen it before. Folks who lived in your house, they didn't stick around long." With that, he walked away, leaving me standing there, a strange chill creeping over me despite the drizzle of rain falling around us. Days passed, and things only got weirder. More objects would move when I wasn't looking. I would leave a door open, come back and find it shut, or I'd turn off a light, only to find it flickering back on. And always, Shadow would be there, just sitting, watching, never making a sound. The idea that maybe, just maybe, Mr. Miller was right started to crawl into my mind. But that was ridiculous, wasn't it? This was just an old cat, not some cursed creature from a horror movie. Still, the incidents grew stranger, more frequent, harder to explain. One night I woke up again, hearing something scratching at the walls. I sat up in bed, listening, trying to figure out what it could be. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, like nails dragging along the drywall. I followed the noise to the living room, where I found Shadow standing by the wall, his eyes fixated on something I couldn't see. He wasn't scratching, just standing there, but the sound continued. I checked outside, thinking maybe it was tree branches or something, but there was nothing. Nothing that should have been making that noise. That's when I started losing sleep. I couldn't rest properly anymore, always waiting for the next strange event. Work became harder to focus on, and my coworkers noticed how tired I looked. I tried to explain, but how do you explain that your cat might be cursed? The final straw came when I found scratches, deep scratches, on the back door. It looked like someone or something had been trying to claw its way inside. I checked Shadow's paws, but they were clean. No dirt, no marks, nothing. I didn't know what to make of it. That's when I decided to confront Mr. Miller, thinking maybe he knew more about the supposed curse. When I knocked on his door, he opened it almost immediately, as if he'd been waiting for me. "Things starting to happen yet?" he asked, without any greeting. I nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. Miller leaned in closer, his eyes wide. "Told you, that cat's no good. Should have gotten rid of it the moment you brought it home. It's watching you, you know." I felt a sudden urge to leave, but before I could, he added one last thing. "You'll see soon enough. You're not the first, and you won't be the last." The tension in the house was unbearable. I found myself avoiding Shadow, feeling like his eyes followed me everywhere. Every time I tried to relax, something would happen. A door slamming, a sudden crash, lights flickering. I was at my wit's end, convinced that maybe there was something to the curse after all. It all came to a head one evening, during yet another storm. I had been sitting on the couch, trying to watch TV, when the power went out suddenly, plunging the house into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight and tried to calm myself down, but deep down I knew something was wrong. I went to check the fuse box, but before I could reach it, I heard a loud bang from the kitchen. I froze, listening. Another bang, louder this time. I slowly made my way into the kitchen, flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. When I got there, I found the back door wide open, swinging in the wind. The deep scratches I had seen before were now even worse, like something had tried to break in. And then, from the shadows, I saw Mr. Miller standing at the edge of my yard, staring at the house. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. I shut the door and locked it, my heart racing as I leaned against the wall, trying to make sense of everything. Was it really the cat? Or was something else happening? The scratching noises started again, this time coming from the attic. I climbed the stairs, gripping the flashlight tightly, dreading what I might find. The attic door creaked as I pushed it open. Shadow sat there, at the far end of the attic, staring at something hidden in the corner. When I looked closer, I saw it. A small hole in the wall, just big enough for someone to have crawled through. That hole explained everything. The strange noises, the moving objects, the flickering lights. It wasn't the cat at all. It was Mr. Miller. I pieced it together quickly, my mind racing as I stared at that hole. He had been sneaking into my house, using the attic as a way in and out. All those times I thought Shadow was staring at nothing. He had been watching Miller. The scratches on the door, the noises in the walls. It was all him, trying to drive me mad, trying to make me believe in the curse. I rushed down the stairs, feeling a mix of anger and fear. I had to confront him, had to stop this madness before it got worse. But when I opened the front door, Miller was gone. I called the police, explaining everything as best as I could. They searched his house and found all the evidence. Lock-picking tools, a spare key, even a notebook filled with notes about my movements. He had been watching me for weeks, maybe even months. Planning this, enjoying every second of it. Miller was taken into custody, charged with stalking and breaking and entering. They found more than enough evidence to link him to similar incidents in the neighborhood. Apparently, he had done this before, targeting other tenants, trying to drive them away, just like he had with me. But even after he was arrested, the unease didn't go away. Every time I looked at Shadow, I couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of dread. I knew it wasn't his fault, but part of me couldn't shake the feeling that maybe there was still something strange about him. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after everything that had happened. But every night, when I locked the doors and turned out the lights, I couldn't help but glance at the attic. I hadn't been up there since the night I found the hole, and I wasn't planning on going back anytime soon. Shadows still sat by the window most nights, staring out into the darkness, as if waiting for something. And sometimes, when the rain fell just like it did on that first night, I swore I could see a figure standing at the edge of the yard, watching. Maybe it was my imagination, maybe it wasn't. But one thing was certain, I would never forget the feeling of those eyes on me, even after they were gone. It started on a night just like any other, the rain gently tapping against the windows like an old familiar song. I had been living in the house for just over a month, still adjusting to the quiet after years of city noise. The neighborhood seemed nice enough, filled with families, older couples, and the occasional dog barking at nothing in particular. But there was something about the stillness, especially when it rained, that left me feeling disconnected. That evening, I had settled in for a lazy night on the couch, a glass of wine in hand, flipping through some mindless show on Netflix, trying to relax after a long day at work. As the hours stretched on, my eyelids began to droop, the steady rhythm of the rain almost lulling me to sleep. And then, out of nowhere, I noticed something strange. Movement at the edge of the window, barely noticeable in my peripheral vision. At first, I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just the rain or maybe a stray branch swaying in the wind. But then, it happened again. A dark shape, faint but there, slipping past the window just outside my living room. I paused the show, squinting towards the glass, trying to focus in the dim light of the room. The figure was gone, leaving only the sound of the rain behind, tapping, tapping, as if it hadn't just played a trick on my tired eyes. A part of me wanted to get up, to go to the window and pull the curtain back to investigate, but another part told me to just let it be. After all, it had been a long day, and my mind was likely just playing games with me in the gloomy atmosphere. Still, that shadow stuck with me. An odd feeling creeping into my thoughts as I sank deeper into the couch, unable to shake the sense that something wasn't quite right. A few days passed, the rain continuing to fall on and off, each night growing a little quieter, a little darker, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I found myself staying up later than usual, keeping the TV on in the background, the chatter and laughter of sitcom characters somehow comforting in the silence. But even with the distraction, my thoughts kept drifting back to that figure outside the window. Maybe it was just the rain playing tricks, I told myself, trying to dismiss the lingering unease that had settled in since that first strange night. Then, one evening, it happened again. I had just turned off the TV, intending to call it a night, when I saw it. Another shadow moving past the window, this time slower, more deliberate. My breath caught as I stared, frozen in place for a moment, eyes locked on the glass, waiting for it to appear again. But just like before, when I went to take a closer look, there was nothing there. Only the rain streaking down the window in uneven patterns, making it hard to tell what was real and what wasn't. I considered opening the door, stepping outside to see if maybe someone was out there, but something held me back. Instead, I grabbed my phone and sent a quick message to a friend, mentioning how weird things had been getting lately. Her reply was casual, teasing even, telling me I was just letting my imagination run wild with all the creepy movies I'd been watching. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more going on. And over the next few nights, I became hyper-aware of every sound, every flicker of movement from the corner of my eye. It was always the same, just a glimpse of a shadow, slipping by so fast I could never get a good look. Each time it happened, I found myself staying up longer, waiting for the next sighting, as if I could catch it in the act. But no matter how long I watched, it always seemed to vanish before I could confirm what I had seen. It had been almost a week since the shadows started appearing regularly, and by now I was no longer dismissing them as tricks of the mind. There was something, or someone, out there, moving around my house, waiting just beyond the rain-soaked windows. The tension built with each passing night, and I found myself becoming more paranoid, checking the locks twice, sometimes 3 times before heading to bed. But even with the doors locked and curtains drawn, The unsettling feeling remained, hovering just below the surface, gnawing at my thoughts. One night, as the rain poured harder than ever, I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed to know what was happening, to find out who or what was moving in the shadows outside my home. I grabbed my coat, threw on some boots, and headed to the back door, determined to confront whatever was out there. The air was cold, the kind that sinks into your bones, and the rain had turned the yard into a muddy mess. But I didn't care. I needed answers. I stepped out into the night, the rain immediately soaking through my clothes, my eyes scanning the yard for any sign of movement. At first, all I saw was darkness, the faint glow of the streetlights doing little to cut through the gloom. But then, there it was, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the lights, still as a statue, watching. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, my brain scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. And then, without warning, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. I didn't chase after it. Instead, I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me, my mind racing with possibilities. Someone had been out there, someone real, and I had no idea why. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the figure in the yard. Who were they? What were they doing? And why were they watching my house? I spent the day scouring through my phone's security app, going over the footage from the night before, hoping to catch a glimpse of the shadowy figure. But to my frustration, the camera had only recorded a brief blur of movement before the figure vanished from sight. I was at a loss, and that's when I decided to take matters into my own hands. I installed more cameras, making sure every inch of my property was covered, and for good measure, I contacted the local police, explaining the strange occurrences. The officer I spoke to was polite, but his response was predictable. There wasn't much they could do without a clear threat or solid evidence. Still, he promised to send a patrol car to check on the neighborhood, just in case. That night, I stayed up again, watching the live feed from the cameras on my phone, my eyes darting between the windows and the screen, waiting for any sign of movement. And then, just past midnight, I saw them. 2 figures this time, creeping along the side of my house, sticking to the shadows like they knew exactly where the cameras were. I called the police immediately, whispering into the phone as I described what I was seeing, my hands shaking as I watched them move closer. The figures lingered at the windows for a few moments, then began trying the doors, checking each one to see if it was locked. I could barely breathe as I watched, terrified of what might happen next. But then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the figures retreated into the night, disappearing from the camera's view. The police arrived minutes later, but by then, the figures were long gone. The days following the break-in attempt were a blur of police reports, security upgrades, and sleepless nights. The officers assured me they were investigating, but without any clear leads or identifiable suspects, there wasn't much they could do. I learned later that there had been a string of similar incidents in the area. Homes being watched, doors tested, but nothing stolen, no one hurt. The burglars were clever, methodical, knowing exactly how to stay just out of reach, leaving behind no evidence. In the weeks that followed, I became hyper-vigilant, watching the cameras constantly, double-checking the locks, jumping at every sound. The shadowy figures never returned, but their presence still lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on me each night as the rain fell. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there somewhere waiting for their next move. Even now, months later, I find myself glancing out the window whenever it rains, half expecting to see those figures again, standing in the shadows, watching. When Nathan moved in next door, no one thought much of it. The house had been empty for almost a year, sitting there like a forgotten relic on our quiet suburban street. It was a rainy evening when I first noticed him. Just a glimpse, really, through the misty curtain of drizzle that blurred the windows. At first glance, he seemed ordinary enough, wearing a dark jacket, hood pulled up against the weather, carrying a single box from his truck into the house. But something about him made me pause. made me look a little longer than I should have. Maybe it was the way he moved, so deliberate, so controlled, as if every step was part of a larger plan. I dismissed it, told myself I was overthinking things, but deep down I knew there was something about him that didn't sit right. Over the next few days, he stayed mostly out of sight, but I could feel him there, in the house next door, like an unfamiliar presence on the edge of my life. The rumors started almost immediately. People said he was strange, that he rarely spoke, that he kept to himself in ways that made folks uneasy. Julie, my wife, didn't care much for the gossip. She was practical, grounded, not one to get swept up in the neighborhood drama. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Nathan was different from the other neighbors we'd had over the years. One night, while Julie was out with friends, I stepped out onto the porch to smoke, the rain tapping steadily on the roof above. That's when I saw Nathan again, standing in his front yard in the downpour, staring at something in the distance. He didn't seem to care about the rain soaking him to the bone. There was no umbrella, no jacket this time, just him and the darkened sky. I watched him for what felt like an eternity, waiting for him to move, to do something. But he just stood there. Eventually, I went back inside telling myself I was imagining things, but I couldn't shake the image of him out there, like some kind of ghost blending into the night. I wasn't the only one noticing strange things either. A week after Nathan moved in, our dog Max started acting strangely. He used to bark at every little thing, a passing car, a squirrel, the mailman. But suddenly he became silent. More than silent, really. He was afraid. He would barely go near Nathan's yard, wouldn't cross the property line, and whenever Nathan was outside, Max would cower inside, his tail tucked between his legs. I tried to laugh it off, but it got under my skin. It wasn't like Max to be scared of anything, let alone a man standing on his porch. One evening, after another particularly rainy day, I saw Nathan sitting on his front step, not moving, just staring at his yard. There was something almost ritualistic about the way he sat, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the ground in front of him. I watched from behind the curtains, trying not to be seen, but I couldn't help myself. Something about him drew me in, even though every logical part of me wanted to look away. That's when the strange symbols started appearing. It was a Saturday morning, and I was heading out to grab the paper from the end of the driveway. I froze when I saw it, a small chalk drawing right by our front door. At first glance, it looked like nonsense, just a few shapes and lines, but the more I stared, the more I felt like it wasn't just random doodling. I called Julie over, but she shrugged it off, said it was probably kids playing around, maybe a prank. But I knew better. I didn't say anything, but I knew. This wasn't just some harmless drawing. There was intent behind it, something darker, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Nathan had something to do with it. Over the next few weeks, things escalated slowly, almost imperceptibly, but I could feel it building. It started with the symbols. First there was one, then another, always in different places. On our sidewalk, on the fence, even on the side of our house. They were never large or obvious, always small enough to be easily missed. But once you saw them, you couldn't unsee them. I wanted to confront Nathan, but every time I thought about it, something held me back. Part of me felt ridiculous, like I was blowing things out of proportion. Julie, of course, didn't seem bothered at all. She joked that maybe Nathan was a failed artist, and this was his way of expressing himself. I didn't laugh. The chalk drawings were one thing, but then the lights started flickering. It wasn't just a one-time thing either. Every evening, like clockwork, the lights in our living room would start flickering, dimming in and out. At first, I figured it was the old wiring in our house. God knows it hadn't been updated in years. But then it started happening at the exact same time every night, 7:15 p.m. sharp. It became a pattern, a routine that I couldn't explain away. One night, I decided to go outside and check the power box, but as I stepped out onto the porch, I saw Nathan standing in his yard again. It was raining, just like the first time I saw him, and again, he was standing there, staring. This time, though, he was looking directly at our house. I swear I could feel his eyes on me, even though I couldn't see his face clearly through the rain. I retreated back inside, telling myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. Julie thought I was losing it. She said I was spending too much time worrying about Nathan and not enough time focusing on real problems. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But every time I looked at Nathan's house, I felt like I was missing something. Like there was a bigger picture that I just couldn't see. And then Bill disappeared. Bill was our neighbor from 2 houses down. We weren't exactly close, but we would chat every now and then. He was the kind of guy who always had an opinion, always knew what was happening in the neighborhood. So, when he stopped showing up to our regular poker games, I started to worry. I hadn't seen him in days. Julie told me not to get involved, that Bill probably just needed some time alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The last time I saw Bill, he was talking to Nathan. It was late, maybe around 10 p.m., and I saw them standing in Nathan's yard, having what looked like a heated conversation. Bill was gesturing wildly, and Nathan just stood there, calm, unmoving. The next day, Bill was gone. No goodbye, no explanation, just gone. The rumors spread quickly. People said Bill had lost his job, that he'd gone bankrupt, that he'd just packed up and left. But that didn't make sense. Bill wasn't the type to just disappear without saying something. I knew there had to be more to it, and I knew Nathan had something to do with it. So that night, I made a decision. I was going to confront him. It was a rainy night as usual, and the wind was howling outside. I waited until Julie went to bed, then I grabbed my jacket and headed next door. Nathan was in his yard again, as if he'd been waiting for me. I walked up to him, my heart pounding in my chest, and demanded to know what he'd done to Bill. Nathan smiled, a slow, unsettling smile that made my skin crawl. He invited me inside. I hesitated for a moment, but then I followed him. Inside, his house was almost completely empty. No furniture, no decorations, just a few boxes scattered around. And in the middle of the room, there was a table with a single folder on it. Nathan gestured for me to sit, and I did, though every instinct told me to get out of there. He opened the folder and slid a photograph across the table. It was a picture of me, taken just a few days ago, standing in my own yard, looking confused and worried. He smiled again and said, "People are easy to control if they believe in the right kind of magic." As Nathan spoke, it all started to make sense, but not in the way I had expected. The symbols, the flickering lights, the strange behavior of my neighbors, it wasn't magic. It was manipulation. Carefully orchestrated, deliberate. Nathan explained that he had dirt on everyone in the neighborhood. Secrets, lies, things people would do anything to keep hidden. He didn't need to use black magic to control them. All he needed was leverage, and he had plenty of that. Bill had been his latest target. He had tried to stand up to Nathan, tried to expose him, but Nathan had known exactly how to break him. It was all there in the folder. Photos, documents, evidence of Bill's affairs, his financial troubles, his weaknesses. Nathan had used them all to ruin Bill's life, and now Bill was gone. Probably fled to avoid the humiliation, or worse, I sat there, stunned, unable to comprehend the sheer cruelty of it all. Nathan had manipulated everyone, made them believe in something dark and supernatural, when all along it had been cold, calculated blackmail. I asked him why he was telling me this, why he hadn't just done the same to me. He leaned in close, his smile never faltering, and said, "Because I enjoy watching people squirm." I left Nathan's house that night feeling like my entire world had shifted. Everything I thought I knew about my neighborhood, about my neighbors, about Nathan, was a lie. I went straight to the police the next morning, handed them the folder, told them everything I knew. But when they went to Nathan's house, he was gone. Just like Bill. The house was empty, as if no one had ever lived there. No sign of the folder, no sign of the photographs, nothing. It was like he had vanished into thin air. The police didn't believe me, of course. They thought I had imagined the whole thing, that I had let my paranoia get the best of me. But I knew the truth. Nathan had been real. His manipulation had been real, and the worst part was, I knew he wasn't finished. A few weeks later, I found a plain white envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a single photograph. It was a picture of me, standing outside Nathan's house the night I confronted him. There were no words, no explanation, just the photo. I locked all the doors that night, checked the windows twice, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. Nathan was still out there somewhere, and he wasn't done playing his games. It was one of those rainy evenings where the world outside blurred into a gray wash of shadows and distant headlights. The kind of evening where every noise seemed just a bit sharper, and the solitude of my house seemed all the more pronounced. I was finishing up work, sitting at my kitchen table, half listening to the rain tapping against the window. The gentle hum of my laptop was the only other sound, a comforting drone that filled the silence. I've lived in this house for a little over 2 years now. A modest place in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing extraordinary, but it was mine. A space that felt safe, familiar. That night, though, it didn't feel quite right. The strangeness started a few weeks ago, though at the time, I didn't think much of it. It began with a dead bird on my doorstep, right there on the welcome mat, almost like a twisted offering. I remember pausing, standing over it, wondering what kind of animal might have left it there. A stray cat, maybe, or something else entirely. It didn't occur to me that it might be a sign, or at least, that's what my neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, would call it. She had all sorts of superstitions, always talking about omens, death warnings, the usual small-town nonsense. I brushed it off back then, tossing the bird into a trash bag without another thought. But now, standing in the dim light of my kitchen, with the rain hammering against the window, I couldn't shake the memory of it. Another bird, dead, lying on my doorstep earlier that morning, just like before. Only this time, its body seemed placed more deliberately, its wings spread wide, head twisted at an unnatural angle. I stood at the kitchen counter, replaying the sight in my mind, feeling a strange sense of repetition settle over me. Was it a coincidence, or was something darker at play? Mrs. Jenkins, words kept echoing in the back of my mind, telling me to watch for the signs. Signs of what, though? I couldn't help but glance toward the front door, half expecting to see something or someone out there, watching. The thought sent a small shiver down my spine, though I quickly dismissed it. There had to be a logical explanation, I told myself. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Something was waiting just beyond my understanding. Over the next few days, the rain continued. Thick sheets of it drumming endlessly against the roof and windows. It was the kind of weather that made you want to stay indoors, cocooned in warmth, while the outside world grew darker and more distant. But inside my house, things started to feel different, like the air had shifted somehow. The dead animals kept appearing on my doorstep, each one a little more disturbing than the last. A bird, a rabbit then, just 2 nights ago, a cat. Its body was mangled, torn in ways that seemed almost deliberate. The symbols started to show up around the same time. At first, I noticed them scratched into the dirt on the sidewalk outside my house. Faint, but there. Then one appeared on the side of my garbage bin, smeared in what looked like ash or dirt. I took photos, planning to ask the neighbors, but something stopped me. It was a silly thought, but part of me wondered if asking would make it all too real. I started spending more time online, looking up strange symbols, omens of death, trying to find anything that might explain what was happening. The search results didn't help. They only made things worse. I found myself spiraling into endless articles about ancient warnings, death markers, and the inevitability of the end. Each one seemed to confirm my growing fear, the nagging sensation that I was being warned. But warned of what? Or who? I caught glimpses of something, or someone, outside my house a few times, late at night. A figure standing too still, too far away to make out clearly. Every time I approached the window, they would be gone, swallowed by the rain and the dark. It became hard to focus on anything else, even at work. I'd sit at my desk, trying to concentrate on marketing plans and client emails, but my mind would wander back to the symbols, the dead animals, the shadows. My coworkers started to notice, asking if everything was okay, but what could I tell them? That I felt like I was being watched? That I thought I was seeing death omens outside my own house? It sounded insane, even to me, but the signs kept coming. The whispers started not long after. Late at night, as I tried to sleep, I would hear faint murmurs like someone speaking just beyond the walls. I'd lie in bed, straining to hear, but it was always too soft, too quiet to make out the words. Part of me thought I was losing it. But the other part, the part that kept obsessing over the signs, believed it was all connected. The rain had finally stopped on the night, everything came crashing down. I came home from work, tired, distracted, and found my front window shattered, shards of glass scattered across the living room floor. For a second, I just stood there, staring at the mess, trying to make sense of it. The symbols, those same strange markings, were etched into the wall next to the window. This time, they were drawn in something dark, something wet. It didn't take long for me to realize it was blood. My body felt heavy, weighed down by a creeping dread I couldn't ignore any longer. I moved through the house, room by room, checking to see if anything had been stolen, anything out of place. Nothing. The only thing different was the symbols, scrawled in a pattern that felt almost familiar by now. I checked the security footage next, my hands fumbling with the controls, but the footage was gone, erased from the cameras. All except for a few minutes from the night before, where I saw a shadow moving past my front door, too fast to make out clearly. I couldn't stay there, not that night. I grabbed my keys and left, driving aimlessly through the wet streets, trying to push the growing terror out of my mind. But I couldn't stop thinking about the symbols, the animals, the broken glass, the whispers I had been hearing. Whoever was doing this knew me, knew how to get inside my head. They were playing a game, and I was the one falling into their trap. It wasn't until I was halfway across town, parked in a quiet lot under the dim streetlights, that the pieces finally started coming together. All the signs, the animals, the symbols, they weren't supernatural, they were planned. Someone had been watching me, stalking me, planting those omens to push me deeper into fear. It wasn't random, it wasn't an accident. And then it hit me. The voice I had been hearing in those faint whispers, it wasn't some eerie, disembodied sound. It was real. I knew that voice. It belonged to someone I hadn't thought about in years. Mark, we had gone on a few dates years ago, nothing serious, but he had been intense. After I ended things, he wouldn't leave me alone for months, messaging me, showing up at places where I hadn't told him I'd be. I thought he had finally moved on, but now it was obvious. He hadn't moved on at all. He had been waiting, watching, planning. Every dead animal, every symbol, every whisper was part of his twisted obsession. I called the police from the car, my voice steady even though my mind was racing. They said they'd send someone to check my house, but I wasn't going back. Not until they found him. Mark was arrested later that night, hiding out just a few blocks from my house in a rundown basement apartment. The police found a journal in his room, pages and pages detailing his obsession with me, his plans to make me see the signs. He had been following me for months, carefully orchestrating each event to make me believe I was being haunted by something otherworldly. It was all so calculated, so methodical. The dead animals, the symbols, the whispers, all part of his sick plan to make me think I was losing my grip on reality. For a while, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching me, even though I knew he was locked away. The police assured me I was safe, but the damage was already done. I changed the locks, installed more cameras, even considered moving, but part of me knew that no matter where I went, the fear would follow. A month passed, and things started to feel normal again, or at least as normal as they could. But just a week ago, I found another dead bird on my doorstep. A part of me wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, a random occurrence. But deep down, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe someone else was watching, waiting for the right moment to make me believe all over again. I'm telling you, bro, this trip was supposed to be the best weekend ever. Me and a few buddies, all geared up, heading to the Adirondacks for some nature therapy. You know, the whole disconnect from the world, find yourself under the stars vibe. I've been hyping it up all week. We even rented this spot by the lake, crystal clear water, trees everywhere, total isolation. A dream. But now I don't even know where to start. So we pull up on Friday, right? It's me, Max, Jess, and Ian, solid crew. Ian's practically Bear Grylls, always talking about how he survived in the wild for a week with nothing but a knife and a tarp. I'm not that hardcore. I'm more of a let's take some Instagram shots and chill by the fire kind of guy. Anyway, the first day's perfect. Hikes, beers, good vibes. We set up camp near this massive oak tree, like something out of a nature doc. But then, things started getting weird. Not in a jump scare horror movie way. It was subtle at first, like your mind's playing tricks on you. We'd be walking along the lake, and I'd swear I saw a tree that wasn't there before, like right in the middle of the path. At first I thought I was just being dumb, or maybe I'd had one too many beers, you know. Anyway, Saturday morning, we decide to hike up to this lookout spot. It's only like a mile away, so no big deal, right? We set out around noon, and everything's going smooth. But halfway up, Jess stops, looking around like she's lost something. She turns to me and goes, "Jason, didn't we pass that rock before?" I laugh it off, 'cause it's just a rock, right? But then Max chimes in saying he feels like we've been walking in circles. Ian's the only one not freaking out, just rolls his eyes and says, "It's the woods, guys. Everything looks the same." Except it didn't. I'm telling you, that tree, we passed it 3 times. Massive pine with this weird scar, like someone tried to carve something into it and then just stopped. Each time we turned around, it felt like it was closer. By the 4th time we saw it, Jess was really freaking out. She's not the scared type, but she grabbed my arm and wouldn't let go. We decided to turn back, figure we could just chill at camp instead. But when we start heading back, it's like the entire forest shifted. Trees were in different places. I'm dead serious. The path we came from wasn't there anymore. It was just gone. And I mean, we're environmental science majors, right? We know how to track, follow trails, all that stuff. But this was like the forest was messing with us. Nemesis, the thing is, it wasn't just the trees. We get back to the lake, finally, and that's when I noticed something even worse. Our tents. They weren't where we left them. Like they'd been dragged closer to the water. Just a few feet, but enough that all of our stuff was wet. My sleeping bag, our food, everything. At first, I thought maybe a bear or something messed with it, but there were no tracks, no signs of anything. It's like the lake itself had reached up and pulled our gear in. We try to shake it off, build a fire, but none of us are really talking anymore. Everyone's uneasy. I mean, how do you explain something like that? Ian's pacing around, muttering to himself, saying it's just our heads playing tricks because we're tired. But then it happens again. Jess screams. We all turn, and she's staring at the lake, pointing. At first, I didn't see it, but then... ripples. Big ones, like something huge just swam right under the surface. But the lake's still, dead quiet. We all edge closer, because of course, we're idiots and can't help ourselves. And then, right as Max steps to the shoreline, bam, something grabs him, yanks him hard, straight into the water. It wasn't like in the movies where he screams for help. It was fast. 1 second he's there, the next he's underwater. Ian and I dive in after him, no thinking, just panic. We're thrashing around, calling his name, but there's nothing. Not even bubbles. And the water's freezing, way colder than it should have been. We finally drag Max back up, coughing and shaking, but he's not saying anything. His eyes, I swear, they were wide, like he'd seen something down there. But when we asked him, he just kept mumbling. The trees, they moved. The rest of the night is a blur. We stayed in the tent, and it felt like the forest was closing in on us. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and every now and then I'd hear branches snapping, footsteps, almost. But no one else was out there. By dawn, we packed up as fast as we could. No one said a word the entire hike back to the car. But here's the thing. As we're leaving, I look back one last time. Just a glance, and there on the shoreline, where our tents had been, that massive oak tree, it wasn't there before. I swear on my life, that tree wasn't supposed to be there. It was watching us. I could feel it. And now, every time I close my eyes, I see that tree. It's like it followed us back, waiting, watching, just out of sight. I haven't told anyone this part, but I went for a walk yesterday. Just around the block, And when I turned the corner, I saw it. That same scarred tree, right there on the sidewalk, like it had always been there. I don't know what's happening, but I feel like wherever I go, it's following me. I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. The wind was like a whisper that night. A low hum threading through the trees, carrying with it the weight of something off. I can't explain it perfectly. I'm not sure I even understand it myself. But that night, standing alone in the snow, everything felt inverted, like reality was folding in on itself. I wasn't sure if it was the wind or if it was something else, but the sounds, nature's symphony of crickets and birds, played backward. Not in a cute, I'll record this and play it in reverse kind of way. No, it was wrong, twisted, like the earth itself was unraveling. I was out near Cascade Canyon in Grand Teton, the snow thick and wet underfoot, the mountains standing like giants against the dark sky. I've been a photographer for years, capturing moments frozen in time, the raw beauty of the wilderness. There's a certain peace in the isolation of Wyoming winters, the kind that gets under your skin in a good way. But that night felt different. The air was sharp, like it was laced with something unnatural. And there was a figure in the snow. I almost didn't notice them at first. They blended into the white so seamlessly, standing out in the distance, just a dark blur at the edge of my vision. My breath hitched in my throat when I saw it. At first I thought it was another hiker, maybe someone lost. But there was something strange about the way they stood. Too still, too quiet, like they weren't supposed to be there. Like they were waiting for something. I raised my camera instinctively, the viewfinder bringing the figure into focus. My hands were shaking, the cold biting through my gloves. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. There was a part of me that didn't want to look, didn't want to know what I was seeing. But curiosity, it always gets the better of me. I zoomed in, and that's when I realized there were no footprints. Nothing leading up to where they stood. The snow around them was untouched, perfect, like they had just appeared. Every rational part of my brain was screaming, telling me to turn back, to get out of there, but I stayed rooted, my body refusing to listen. That's when it moved. It was subtle at first, just a shift in its posture, like it was adjusting itself. But then, the thing started walking toward me, slowly, deliberately. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, the rhythmic thud pounding against my chest, drowning out everything but the crunch of its steps in the snow. Each step it took toward me sounded wrong, distorted, like the sound itself was struggling to exist in this world. I tried to take a step back, but my legs were stiff, frozen in place. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was as if the air had thickened around me, pulling me down, rooting me in the snow. The thing was closer now, close enough that I could see it clearly, and God, I wish I hadn't. Its face, or what I thought was its face, was hollow, just a black, gaping void, like a hole punched through reality. No eyes, no mouth, no nose, just nothing. But it was watching me. I could feel its gaze, heavy and cold, like it was piercing through me, dragging out all the warmth from my bones. My camera slipped from my hands, landing in the snow with a dull thud, but I didn't even flinch. All I could do was stand there, staring into that endless blackness. It reached out a hand, long and twisted, fingers like skeletal branches stretching toward me. The closer it got, the colder I felt, like I was being pulled into a void, like I was becoming part of it. And that's when I heard the sound of something behind me. Moving, slow, wet. I wanted to turn around to see what it was, but I couldn't. My body was stuck in that moment, stuck in that space between the thing in front of me and the unknown creeping up from behind. The inverted sounds of the forest grew louder, warping and twisting, filling my ears until all I could hear was that awful backward melody. And then, in a heartbeat, everything went silent. The figure stopped, its hand hovering just inches from my face. It tilted its head, as if considering me, or maybe savoring the moment. And then it spoke, or maybe it didn't. Maybe it was just a sound in my head, but it was there. Words that weren't words, a language that didn't exist, whispered directly into my mind. You don't belong here. The words hit me like a physical force, knocking the wind out of me, and in that instant I could move again. I staggered back, nearly falling into the snow, my legs trembling as I tried to put distance between us. But it didn't follow, it just stood there, watching, waiting, like it had done what it came to do, like it had already claimed me. I turned and ran. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, the snow kicking up behind me, my breath ragged and uneven. The sounds of the forest came back, but they were still wrong, still backward. The wind carried whispers, faint and distorted, like voices calling out from another place. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, throwing myself inside and slamming the door shut. Locking it like that could somehow keep whatever that thing was out, but I can't shake it. Even now, weeks later, I can still feel it watching me. Every time I close my eyes, I see that hollow face, that void, staring back at me. I haven't been back to the park since. I can't bring myself to go. I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. I've led my fair share of cave tours. I've seen some weird things down in the caverns, heard stranger stories, but nothing like this. Nothing that sticks with me like what happened that night in Carlsbad. It was a quiet Thursday evening. Late fall. Crisp but not cold. Perfect camping weather. I had 2 clients, just a couple, Jim and Sarah. They'd been married about 6 months, in that let's go on an adventure phase. They were the kind of people who think they know what they're doing, but really don't. They were eager. But I could tell this was their first real outing. We set up camp about a mile from the cave entrance. I chose that spot because it's off the main path, isolated. You could feel the desert swallowing you whole. The stars in New Mexico are no joke. When you're out there, it feels like you're in a dome with nothing but stars above. We cooked dinner, swapped stories. I told them a few spooky tales about the caves, just to set the mood. It was all in good fun. They seemed to enjoy it. After a while, I suggested we take a quick night hike to a cave I'd scoped out before. It wasn't a marked trail, one of those secret spots I like to take clients who can handle it. They were game, so we grabbed our headlamps and set off. The trail down was narrow, with high walls on both sides. It gave you that feeling like the earth was squeezing you tighter. The further we went, Jim was ahead, shining his light on every little rock, every plant. Sarah kept close behind me, nervous but trying to act tough. We finally reached the cave's mouth, a jagged opening that looked like the earth had ripped itself apart. I warned them to watch their footing. This cave wasn't like the touristy spots. It was deeper, darker, and not as friendly. The air was heavy, damp. It made your skin prickle, but they wanted the full experience. And hell, I live for this stuff. So in we went. About 10 minutes in, the temperature dropped. Not just a little either, that bone-chilling cold that creeps under your clothes and settles in your spine. I noticed it first. Then Sarah muttered something about the air feeling thick. I brushed it off. We were deep underground. What do you expect? Then Jim stopped dead in his tracks. His light fixed on the cave wall up ahead. At first, I thought it was just a formation, maybe a stalagmite. But no, his beam of light was shaking, like his hand had gone numb. "Do you see that?" he whispered. I stepped up next to him, squinting into the dim light. At first, it didn't register what I was looking at, but then the outlines started to sharpen, like they were pulling themselves into focus. There were figures, people, standing just beyond the reach of our lights. They looked off, like they weren't solid, more like shadows, with just enough form to be recognizable as human. I froze. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging in. Jim took a shaky step back. The figures, there were 4 or 5 of them, just stood there, not moving, not speaking, just existing. Their clothes weren't right. They looked old, like something out of a black and white photo from the late 1800s. The men wore suspenders, long-sleeved shirts, pants tucked into boots. The women had long skirts, brushing the cave floor. Before I could process what I was seeing, they started to fade, not walk away, not disappear suddenly. No, it was like they were dissolving, fading into the rock, like the cave was swallowing them. In less than a minute, they were gone, leaving us in this suffocating silence. I could feel my heart pounding, each beat rattling my rib cage, like it was trying to break free. No one said anything. We just stood there, dumbfounded, until the silence became unbearable. "Let's get out of here," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. We turned to leave. But that's when the air changed again. It felt thick, oppressive, like the weight of the whole cave was pressing down on us. I swear I could hear something behind us, a faint shuffling, almost like footsteps, but distorted, like the echoes didn't quite line up with reality. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see those figures again, but there was nothing, just the cave's jagged walls and the void beyond. But the sound didn't stop. It followed us, growing louder, more chaotic. It wasn't footsteps anymore. It was like 1,000 whispers, overlapping, swirling around us, filling the cave with this maddening, disorienting noise. We started running, scrambling over rocks, slipping on the damp ground. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing as we pushed forward, the light from our headlamps flickering like they were on the verge of dying. Jim tripped, smashing into the rock. Sarah screamed, but we didn't stop. We couldn't. That noise, it was everywhere. In my head, in the walls, under my skin. I could barely think straight, but one thing was clear. We had to get out. We finally made it to the cave's mouth, stumbling out into the cold night air, gasping for breath like we'd been drowning. The desert was silent again. The stars above looked almost too bright, too still. For a second I thought maybe we'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just our minds playing tricks in the dark. But then Jim pointed to the ground near the cave entrance. There were footprints, old weathered ones, like they'd been pressed into the earth decades ago. I looked at him, then at Sarah. Neither of us said a word. We packed up camp that night and hiked out before dawn. I've never been back to that cave. I never thought I'd be one of those people with a "this actually happened to me" story. But here I am, sitting in my living room in Denver sharing this because, well, I don't know why. Maybe I need to get it out. Maybe I need to know I'm not losing my mind. It happened last October. My husband, Matt, and I had planned a weekend getaway to the desert edge of Rocky Mountain National Park. One of those remote spots where the trees thin out. The landscape turns into stretches of sand and rock. It was our little escape from the world. We'd been married 12 years, and these trips kept us grounded. Just the two of us and the wild. This time, though, it felt different. Maybe it was the chill in the air, or the way the sunset bled across the horizon, more orange and red than usual. It felt like we were walking into something, not nature, but something alive, watching us. I could tell Matt felt it too. He's the kind of guy who doesn't scare easily, but he'd been quiet all afternoon. Kept looking over his shoulder, even when there was nothing but the wind stirring the sand. We set up camp near the old ruins of some mining town, long abandoned. They were just crumbling stone walls now, half buried by time. There's something eerie about places like that, echoes of the past, you know? But I didn't pay it much mind at first. I'm a nurse. I deal with life and death on a regular basis. The ghost stories we make up about old ruins? I've never bought into any of it, until that night. The wind picked up around midnight, howling through the canyons, making the tent flap violently. I woke up to it, sharp and cold, like it was cutting through my skin. But there was something else. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But no. Beneath it, there were voices. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. Battle cries, the sound of horses galloping, metal clashing against metal, like a war was being fought just over the next ridge. I sat up, heart pounding, trying to shake the sleep from my head. "Matt," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. He grunted and turned over, eyes half closed. "Do you hear that?" He didn't answer at first. Then he blinked, slowly coming to. "Hear what?" "The voices," I said, barely breathing the words. He sat up too, eyes narrowing. For a moment there was nothing but the wind, and then like a wave crashing over us, the sound returned. Louder this time. Screams of pain, of fear. and behind them a deep, rhythmic chant, ancient, unsettling. Matt scrambled out of the tent, pulling on his boots. I followed, even though every instinct told me to stay put, to hide. But curiosity got the better of me. That's always been my problem. The desert stretched out before us, cold and empty under the sliver of moonlight, nothing but rocks and shadows. But the sounds, the battle, the chanting filled the air. Heavy and suffocating, it was like we were standing in the middle of a battlefield we couldn't see. "I don't like this," Matt muttered, glancing around like he expected something to jump out at us. "Let's pack up and leave." But before we could even move, the ground beneath us trembled. I felt it, deep in my bones, like a shudder, as though the earth itself was waking up. My heart raced. "What the hell is going on?" I asked, my voice shaking. Matt opened his mouth to answer, but then he froze. His eyes went wide, staring at something behind me. Slowly, I turned. At first I thought it was just a mirage, a trick of the moonlight, but as my eyes adjusted I saw them. Figures marching through the desert, hundreds of them. Their bodies were twisted, grotesque, faces half-melted, eyes hollow, dressed in torn, ancient armor. They moved as one, but their feet didn't touch the ground. They floated just above the sand, like spirits locked in some eternal march, and the sounds, the battle cries, the chanting poured out of them. Even though their mouths didn't move, I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, my pulse hammering in my ears. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I've seen dead bodies before. I've worked with the dying. But this was beyond anything I could comprehend. "We need to go," Matt said, his voice barely above a whisper. We stumbled back toward the tent, but the ground kept shaking, harder now, like something massive was crawling beneath the surface. I heard a crack, like a bone snapping. I turned just in time to see one of the stone walls crumble. From the darkness behind it, something emerged. It was a figure, tall and shrouded in a cloak made of shadow. Its face, if you could even call it that, was a twisted mess of flesh and bone, its eyes burning with a pale, unnatural light. It didn't walk. It glided toward us, slow and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. I couldn't move. I was frozen, rooted to the spot as it drew closer. The chanting grew louder, echoing in my head, each word digging into my skull like a knife. And then, just as it reached out a hand toward me, Matt grabbed my arm and yanked me backward. We ran. I don't remember how far or how long. My legs were burning, my lungs on fire, but I didn't care. All I knew was that we had to get away, had to outrun whatever was behind us. We didn't stop until the sun started to rise, casting long shadows across the desert. Only then did we collapse onto the ground. Gasping for breath, my heart still racing. The sounds were gone, the figures, the chanting, everything had vanished with the night. But the fear stayed with me. It's still with me. I don't know what we saw out there. Maybe it was the echoes of some ancient battle. Maybe it was something worse, something older than we could understand. All I know is, we weren't alone in that desert. And whatever was out there, it wasn't human. If you ever find yourself camping out near the old ruins, listen closely to the wind. You might hear it too, the echoes of the past haunting the present. And if you do, for the love of God, run. Because some things aren't meant to be seen.